Sometimes I wonder if there's a wrong way to consume media. When something feels important and you walk away from it without having gained anything new, you start to think you're a dum-dum, you know? Like you dressed up to go to a fancy restaurant and somehow only got a glass of ice. Just bear with me, okay? When there's a game that exists, that has been built for 10 years, being headed by Square Enix, a massive company on a flagship franchise that they're obligated to care about, and its trailers look this good, you get the vibe you're gonna make the stupidest contrarian essay in a few years. But it was also the product of a lot of people. And I can tell the difference between something the developer cared about and another where the job was kinda like... I played this game a lot as a kid, Star Ocean till the end of time, and I loved it, but if I held it up to even 1% of the scrutiny I'm going to hold the topic of this video to, I would give it a 2 out of 10. When I beat Final Fantasy 15, I was 1 year out of high school, busy getting fat and building my personality after YouTubers who slanted their eyes while looking at things. There I was, not surprised or elated or anything. I was old enough to know that it was okay to not love a game, but I was also young enough to recognize that the happiness I felt for the things I did was going down a subtle slope. And look, I get that this isn't important. It's not like I was on the fucking cross at the time. But all of that build-up about this game, the promises, the hype, the love from the community, you know? It felt like it was supposed to mean something. Then 5 years passed, and maybe the answer to my question is no. That game just had nothing to really say in it. And the problem with that is that in those 5 years, I have replayed Final Fantasy 15 between 4 and 5 times. I think this game has a beautiful message about how life is unfair, but the bonds and memories around you can still make it worth living. I also think it's a dumb game about filling up gas and having too many combat mechanics. But first I want to give you both a sense of scale and a justification. You see, Final Fantasy 15 was a very big game, and while I want to talk about it as a game, I also want to discuss it as a phenomenon. Just to give you a small glimpse, there are demos, extra games, movies, animes, a pocket version, crossover DLC, timed events, a book, DLC in other games, and so much other stuff that people probably don't even know got added into the game. Hell, I think most people just remember the hype train alone. The main theme is even done by Florence and the Machine. I don't know who that is, but I vaguely recognize the name is important. I'm gonna try to give this some structure so that you can break things down into segments and watch it in chunks. Or just like, click off it. YouTube saves your spot in the video. It's not 2011 anymore. We're going to start from the beginning of the game and flow downwards onto the end while stopping at the side to ramble about those things we don't like. Let's talk story because, well, you know, RPGs, stories, worthless creative writing degree, I gotta do it. And in order to critique the writing, I need to elaborate on the 3 pillars of the game's story. These come directly from interviews, so this is not some framing device that resides inside my insane little brain. Final Fantasy XV's 3 pillars are as follows. The first pillar is the bonds between the hero and his friends, the second is the bonds between the hero and his father, and the third are the bonds between the hero and the world he's set to rule. Keep these in the back of your head because we're gonna play hopscotch onto each one at some point. The world of Final Fantasy 15 is not a terrible one, but it'd be at the bottom of the cup if you get what I mean. It's a modern-day world that has 2 big countries at war. One that uses magic and everyone is happy, then another that uses technology and everyone is dying. Because a neophobe wrote this game, the Magic City is the good one, and the one that's run by Elon Musk is the bad one. I don't need complete moral ambiguity in my games, but the good capital city of Insomnia is this pristine bathhouse that actually looks like it's the living form of the king's winning smile. But you'll find that Niflheim bathes itself in darkness and probably has good internet. The protagonist is the Prince of Insomnia named Noctis Lucius Caelum, and he never ever complained about that, which is a bizarre exception because he complains about everything else. He is joined by an entourage of 3 paid actors, each of which could probably be described by an Instagram profile. There's Gladio, a bodyguard covered in tattoos that say rise and grind, Ignis, whom wears glasses, so obviously he's a race realist, and Prompto, who uses his slightly unearned following to spotlight his artist friends' tweets and join in on every #IsOver party. We open in a throne room where Noctis' father gives them blessing to go on their journey. Oh, sorry, that's not the right opening. There was a prologue where they fought a fire demon and... Oh, no, wait, I'm actually talking about Final Fantasy 15 Prologue, Parting Ways. A fucking audiobook that describes everyone's last nights in the city. That's right, when I said I did my homework, I meant it, and no, you can't copy off my notes. Noctis and his friends are going on a road trip. And credit where it's due, I really like the scenes that follow. Their car almost instantly breaks down because Prompto is driving it, and they push this car in this almost human and normal way.
Unbelievable.
Not exactly a fairy tale beginning, huh, Prince Noctis?
We let ourselves get carried away.
Look, these things happen.
Despite the fact that Noctis is the son of a king, and every hand on the regalia has been taught to fight for that king, it's not a story about larger-than-life characters, as they slowly but inoffensively bicker with each other while we pan out to see the larger world that awaits us. After Noctis and the fellas get in enough steps to exhaust Halo 5, we reach this game's version of Sid and his daughter with giant titties. Sid is a bumbling, grumpy old man that knows Noctis' father. After an awkward exchange, he tells Noctis that he has to pay for his car repairs by dealing with monsters on the other side of the street. I guess Lucis doesn't do the whole, you should listen to your fucking king idea. Final Fantasy XV dropped the turn-based combat for real action combat, which got many to be at least a little upset. But in my very sexy contrarian ways, I can't say that I care. There have been several sequels in long-running series that have had major changes to their gameplay, and I'm mostly convinced that giving creative directors the ability to make that pivot will always result in a better experience. If they don't suck at it anyway. This is an oxymoron, but this game has some of the most overcomplicated but simple gameplay I've ever seen. The tagline for FFXV was a Final Fantasy for fans and first-timers, and I can pretty confidently say that it appeals to neither. The fighting in this game relies on a 2-button system. You hold circle to run up to the nearest enemy and attack them. By tilting the stick, you can pull different types of swings out of these weapons. By holding square, Noctis will begin to dodge enemy attacks, so long as he has the MP to do so. Alongside that, each of the 4 directions on the D-pad can equip a weapon, which can be swapped to whenever so that you can mix and match in accordance with the enemy's weaknesses. In theory, anyway. Combat in Final Fantasy XV has 2 stages. You stand back holding square to give yourself time to think, then warp in to attack because there really is nothing to think about. Of course, once you get into things, it'll get confusing, as you might expect for a game that required 4 preludes. You won't be able to see who you're hitting, random garbage will attack you, and fancy team moves will just trigger then miss. I think it's worth noting that it's not the worst combat system I've ever played, maybe on a list somewhere is all. In my opinion, combat in games really isn't about giving you a skill-based challenge as much as it is asking you to engage with the world and understand its struggles. You can do that by making combat difficult, but the most important thing is that every move, weapon, and special attack says something about the story. Final Fantasy XV tries to do this, except it's kind of confused. If I were to describe what the combat in Final Fantasy XV says about the party, it'd be bipolar. On one hand, all of his friends will pamper him and make sure that their precious baby doesn't get a scratch on him, and on the other, the baby will be running around with the giant chainsaw made of light. Noctis is a hard protagonist to describe at this point in the plot, but I'm pretty damn good at describing things by now. You know how every single college student takes pride in the lazy part of their life? Like they built their identity from YouTube comments about the ideal college student? Look, I stay in late because the school system is happier to take my money than see me enriched as a person. Wow, I'm gonna eat this $1 meal even though I have my mom's credit card because fuck it, I'm quirky. No, Kyle, you're failing math. Get out of bed and do something interesting instead of waiting to become interesting. From the onset, we get to see what Noctis is going to be. He's going to grow from this lethargic and kind of dour guy that avoids responsibility into an inspiring leader. He's a prince, so it's kind of a coming-of-age story where Noctis needs to learn to take responsibility with the help of his friends. That's how he appears in the final game, but Noctis' development has been one of the weirdest parts about Final Fantasy XV. He used to be a more edgy character that could see the quote-unquote light. Then he was a Kingdom Hearts character. Then he grew a grudge against the light because they needed to mod the shadows in the game so that his massive hair doesn't block out his face. That isn't to say that Noctis doesn't have fans or people that like him. Hell, I can even see why. He has an air of normality to him, can do some cool stuff with his powers, and his reality-bending hair is also kind of hot. I wouldn't call him a 100% failure, but removed from a few poignant moments, Noctis very rarely emotes or gives us a reason to be invested in him. His journey is to go from prince to king, but what that means is never directly addressed. He saw his dad be a king, but we sure as hell didn't. Even with the extended universe at our backs, Noctis was meant as this tragic character of sorts, Shakespearean or Yeekian, the type that doesn't outright explain his actions and is meant to be dissected. He's covered in Latin symbolism, his name roughly translating to light in the night sky. There's this theme about sleep and dreaming. I'd argue there's some dissonance with this particular idea. Outside of some imagery in the very last moments, there's no thread for me to grab and hold on to. But it wasn't always this way. Noctis sleeping was intensely tied to his creation. I don't have too much to say on this because I don't like talking shit, but one of the things most people remember about this game's development is the swap from Tetsuya Nomura at the helm to Hajime Tabata. Look, I don't really plan on pinning 2 JPEGs of Japanese strangers on screen and showing them fight. I will say that Nomura has made games that I like, and Tabata certainly hasn't, but issues with a project can come from all over the place, and I assume there are no hard feelings. Until Kingdom Hearts 3, where Nomura tried to reclaim his parentship with Yozora over here, who is Noctis in every way, but from 13 years ago, and might also be Noctis' nobody. I don't know much about the Kingdom Hearts series, okay? You were just supposed to extend the universe, not reboot, goddammit. In an interview, it was mentioned that Noctis has a problem bottling up his emotions because of a traumatic event in his childhood. I referenced that in terms of an interview and not the game because you could have told me his head was full of fuzzies and I'd be just as liable to believe it. One of the biggest problems with the story is that the writers never really accommodate Noctis's refusal to explain how he feels. If they wanted something like this to work, it probably would have been better to replace the flaming action movie opening with the event that made him permanently feel like closing himself off was a good idea. Character first impressions are very, very important, and if we got to see what he's afraid of in a dramatic scene, the player would then preface every single restrained line of dialogue with that lens of insecurity. Oddly enough, the world of Final Fantasy XV was one of its biggest marketing pushes. Trailers of Noctis talking about how beautiful Eos is, raving about how much there is to see and do, stuff like that.
We'll follow the truth wherever it takes us. Together. Come along for the ride.
Though that may just be one of the confused symptoms of Final Fantasy XV's marketing overall. Considering that I'm one of the few people that remembers Yongya's countdown retrospective on this game, I'd like to say that I was very jacked into the hype train, when I could have done things like pass my classes or prematurely start my quest to emotionally self-destruct. Final Fantasy XV wasn't just a game, its release was an event. It was an era where bits of information being dripped out was a new episode. In a way, Final Fantasy XV was kind of already out, with the game actually reaching the end of its development being like some sort of bizarre season finale. For example, let's take a peek at the Platinum demo. It was available to everyone and completely free, coming out in March 30th of the game's release year. The demo existed as a vertical slice of the game where people would explore a dream through Noctis's child self. There was some combat and some exploration, as well as taking you to some of the game's biggest areas. Fighting in this was limited to 3 attacks and a block button. It was simple, but for a lot of people, this was the first taste of a story that was being called the ultimate Final Fantasy, because game websites are just marketing divisions with terrible takes. And to be honest, this demo is like a bad first date because all of the red flags are here. It plays like one of those user-generated missions from Infamous 2. The lines are delivered through a cell phone indicator at the bottom, which is the laziest and easiest way to get across something, as well as having just really bad voice direction from whoever was voicing Kid Noctis. The story could have carried some extra weight since this is the event I'm talking about. It is the repressed world of Noctis's psyche while he goes through the traumatic event of watching his handler get murdered. And yeah, that probably does make for a bad first date. I'll tell you the meat of this demo though. It's these little buttons that Chibi Noctis can step on, which will make your PS4 do a little leap in the air and whoa! The demo doesn't even have a health bar. Taking damage just reduces your points, and the less points you have, the less buttons are available to you. It ends with Noctis growing up and facing a real enemy from the game, a large iron golem. It's the kind of fight that's really good at selling the combat engine. It's big, its attacks are impressive, and you can try pretty much anything that the main game would provide you. And it doesn't offer Dave & Buster's coupons to do it. It's weird, because tackling Final Fantasy XV's extended universe also leaves me with this bizarre feeling that I shouldn't be playing these. They feel awkward and stiff, like I'm disturbing some long-dead tomb. To be honest, I might be the last person on Earth to ever play this thing, especially considering that it's delisted from stores. The intrepid adventurer lifestyle truly chose me. I have no real proof of this, but I've got a gut feeling that most people's best encounter with Final Fantasy XV's combat will be in the second town, Golden Key, as there are a handful of hunts that will probably push you to fight really tough enemies. They'll take a good 20 minutes, but you'll see the combat riding its line between slow enough to be engaging while also approachable enough to be interesting. That's because as you play, your experience will probably sprawl out into something that isn't exactly cohesive. One of the joys of a leveling system is gaining new abilities, each new move set to build on the combat you already know. And for me, not knowing when you get that new ability adds to that excitement. As everyone will usually level up together, there are 4 chances that you might gain a new power. In this mess, leveling up does 2 things. It gives you AP and increases your stats. Stats are basic, more damage, more health, more warp attack spam, but AP is funneled into this ascension screen. It's mostly okay, but it has 2 problems, scarcity and control. Scarcity means that in your average playthrough of Final Fantasy XV, chances are good that you'll only get to fill about half of the skill tree, incentivizing you to pick certain branches and pour a lot of your points in them. The second problem is a bit more difficult to define. By giving the player control of what area they spec in, there's no mystery. I can open the Ascension menu right at the beginning, find out how each of the Backstreet Boys are going to grow by the end, and then start working towards that. When characters randomly gain new skills, it's also adding to the player's perception of that character, as they had an established limit to their abilities that this new level up has just broken. if a character isn't being helpful in combat, the player will always believe that they might learn a skill that can change that. And yes, I do tie my emotional stability to a fucking level up system, and by God cross my YouTuber little arms if I'm not proud of it. I know that this is a fairly fascist game design idea, but I really don't think players have the imagination to pick their skills in a way that will maximize their enjoyment. Hence why, even though people throw themselves at the materia system from Final Fantasy VII, I don't like that either. I don't like anything. I'll cross them, don't think I fucking won't. For 100% role-playing games, I kind of get it because that's their selling point. I just hate that it's everywhere. When you take a bunch of distinct abilities and spread them out to all of the cast members, you've really taken away a unique storytelling mechanic, and now everyone is a walking set of holes looking for their chips. In FF15, the characters do have distinct traits, but it's really hard to notice them actively filling their roles. I still have no clue what they're going for with Noctis, so we'll label him with the role of Prince of Pissing His Pants. Then there's Gladiolus, who deals heavy damage, has the highest health, and can't do math. Ignis does support stuff. And lastly, there's Prompto, who takes up the precious role of the group's twink. This is mostly related to their active combat. You can briefly excite them by giving them a command or assuming control, like the PlayStation-wielding parasite you technically are. In both of these, they really shine, but when they're simply going about the battlefield, you won't really feel their input. Noctis, of course, has his own magical abilities, but they aren't communicated very well, like he's in a bad D&D campaign. You might assume at first glance that it's got the typical rules where everyone can use magic, but it's really just Noctis. Instead, he gains his abilities from a giant crystal that gives its powers to the bloodline that rules Insomnia, cause I would choose the wielder of light the same way my boss hands out promotions. He summons weapons from thin air so he doesn't have to carry them around, he can phase through things to evade, and can warp to where he throws his weapon. Who needs gas when you have MP? He can also turn any soda drink into a healing concoction. Internal hemorrhaging? Here's an Arizona. Need to cure poison? Use this to purge. There's even a spell crafting system where you can drop different Wingstop sauces to give spells different effects. I get the vibe that early in development he had some kind of theme with his powers that would give the player a defined rule set of what he can and can't do, but then the axe came swinging and they needed to cover up the plot holes with whatever was on hand. In a lore sense, all his powers are built around the idea that he's just a video game character. Noctis can also share this power with anyone he wants to. Wait, what? You already did the eugenics route, why can he suddenly make everyone else super? Hell, only giving out the crystal superpowers to your peacekeeping officers and close buddies seems like a good way to evoke a different kind of power altogether. Now look, I am a YouTuber with over 4,000 hours in this game, which was not something your average Xbox player had. Most people didn't swim in games media that prepared them for the dropping of Final Fantasy 15 like it was their first day of high school. What I'm trying to say is that this game confused the shit out of people. The context we got from the opening could have presented this game as a military mission, an expedition, or a fucking vacation for all a newbie could have known. Back then, all I ever really understood at this point was that the prince wanted to go to a place called Altissa, and that a woman named Luna was involved. Upon a third look at the opening, I now know that they would marry, and all they needed to do was get there by boat. This marriage was meant to stop that war I told you about at the beginning, meaning it's option A. Then the gang is stopped by a funny man in a hat that throws a coin at them and tells them that there are no boats and that they'll need to explore the rest of Hamilton County before world peace is an option. After sleeping to recover from a long day of killing crabs and grinding experience, we get the actual catalyst and direction the story is going. And I must say, Noctis must have needed that sleep pretty hard because he hallucinates his dreams in a level of animation beyond what he should be able to understand. But it's time to slow down, serious shit's about to happen.
Insomnia Falls. What?
So, the king died, and it gets broken via newspaper, even though I know you have internet, you clowns! Noct, check it out! Your dad got cancelled! Just as a reminder, Noctis is trying to marry his childhood friend Luna Freya to negotiate a peace treaty with Niflheim. Right? Okay? Then, while signing that peace treaty, they altered the deal. I guess having a gun really does help against amethyst crystals. That is a lot to convey in just 4 paragraphs, but this is likely what you might understand of the story after your second playthrough. This lack of clarity really messed up a lot of people playing the game for the first time. Over time, you can figure out what's happening in an easy way, but this is a YouTube video. I can't afford to leave any of you ducklings behind. Here's the deal, I'm gonna tell you the entire story. It's time to go invade Niflheim back, get a ring that instantly kills everything, and still marry that hoe. Except, no, not really, I'm still sitting in this car. while everyone talks back and forth about coffee. You'll find that a lot of the things you do in Lucis seem to be disconnected from the larger plot. That's really because the protagonist's overarching goal is always changing. At first, it was go to Altissa and marry Luna. 2 paragraphs from now, it'll be open all the royal tombs. 1 chapter later, it's awaken the 6 gods of Eos and fight them. Eventually, it's get the crystal back from the Empire, and after doing some backflips and punching me, we get to restore light to the throne. If I were to offer advice that literally doesn't work, I'd say out of all the plot lines, they should have focused on the gods and their fights. Early on, you find a book that describes each one, and I love that kind of thing. When a game sets up a bunch of unknown threats that I'll have to face at some point. It's fucking hype, because if you did it right, I'll have just enough to wonder about their powers, and you'll constantly have me sitting and guessing what the inevitable showdown with them is going to be like. Not to spoil, but to absolutely spoil, the reason I said this wouldn't work is because out of the 6 gods, you fight 3 of them, and 2 are not fun to face. As a nice little treat, you can speculate on which ones I like and dislike. After looking at Twitter's trending tab, we get our first taste of the game's dungeons. First, we go around an Imperial blockade, fight through some disposable tin soldiers, and I get to go, yup, city's on fire. Then I'm taken to another dungeon to find the game's first royal arm. It's an abandoned shelter and the characters walk around it like they've got nowhere to be. It's cool that we're in a different area, but it's just a vehicle to do some fights in a straight line. There are alternate paths, but environmental detail is non-existent, and the items lying around are uninteresting garbage. There's a lot that goes into making a game environment exciting, but Final Fantasy doesn't give you any reasons to stop and look around, as every hallway is just a copy-paste version of the other with some slight variation. It doesn't feel like gameplay first, narrative second, it feels like gameplay first, brain cells last. No thought, no nothing, just walk forward, hold circle, tap X. I'd hold this up to every main dungeon, with the side ones only being a smidge better. There is a mini-boss at the end, but it's more mini than boss, and the reward is a royal axe that gets covered in a later section. If we want to see the rest of the game, we need to break through a different Imperial blockade. Yes, there are 2. Aren't you spoiled for choice? Niflheim drops these admittedly kind of cool flying bases that unfold and deploy right on the spot. But there is one cool boss here. We need to beat this giant robot headed by someone who has the same haircut as the gang, but less self-awareness. After destroying that, the game has officially begun. We have the entire county to explore. And credit where it's due, this game is beautiful. Seeing all these locales from the comfort of your car and just taking it in adds so much to it. I'm the type that can get a lot out of game worlds. I'll sit there and look at things, trying to disassemble the hundreds of hours poured into it by the artists, to just be impressed by all the work that goes into turning this horizon into something that looks amazing no matter what angle you see it from. Then you step out of the car, and it's walking. A lot of walking. While the highways offered you a good look at the beauty, all there is out here are random enemies and vegetables to pick up. Sometimes the game gives you an excuse to go out here, like when this fucking freak asks you to go get her frogs. But the rewards hiding out here are far and few between. Let me give you an example. While walking through the world, I begin heading into this dungeon, and I see a fork in the road that I've never gone down before. After a small turn, I see this hut, run by a woman who speaks like Yoda.
Come again, you must.
This is the House of Hexes. I want you to think about what that entails. Perhaps this witch sells a one-of-a-kind weapon, or pre-made spell bombs. And the answer is that she sells the exact same shit you can find everywhere else. If you want to put a magic witch in the woods who sells green tea, at least get realistic and have her lace the fucking things. I want to dive a little deeper into the friends and the major party, since that's one of the story aspects that never loses screen time. In normal RPGs, your party will get filled to the brim with characters from all walks of life and personalities. You know, when the literal creator of worlds is toppled by a kitty girl and a mathematician, that sort of thing. There was some backlash at the main party only having 4 party members that are all white guys, but I actually like this aspect of the game. I guess all it took was for Square Enix to axe diversity in order to make me happy. It brings a nice homely atmosphere that you can't get when the guy in the back seat won't shut up about fucking zeptograms. Whilst I generally do appreciate diversity, the goal here is to highlight that lack of representation, making them a tightly knit group of city kids that don't understand anything outside their home. You could have made them more ethnically appealing, but as long as they grew up in the same place and act like they're in a COD lobby, I'm pretty much fine with it. To contrast, in Final Fantasy XIII, the party is about as diverse as Japan will let it be, because in that that game, the conflicts between the cast members was meant to drive the narrative, and they all needed to come from different walks of life to achieve that. I think the game does fail to develop this group in one key feature though. It does a somewhat okay job at establishing Noctis's relationship with each party member, but it fails to give us a window into how they view each other. In an interview, Tabata stated that he wanted the game's full focus to be on Noctis, so we live the adventure through his lens. And all I can say to that is maybe you should have put more effort into making the guy hold a story on his own. One of the gang's defining traits is that they do literally anything for Noctis, but I'd be much more susceptible to that if I can imagine them doing anything else. Without the protagonist, I don't know what these goons would be doing. Their entire lives are about him. No other friends, no commitment, just Noctis. That's not loyalty, that's a toxic relationship if I've ever heard of one. To find out how the gaslighting began, you need to look at the anime series by A1 Pictures, Final Fantasy XV Brotherhood. This anime was released before the game came out, with episodes fixating on each party member. It's free, and it's fine. I watched the whole thing, and I never felt like there was something I could have been doing with my time that was better. Though I will tell you that nothing was more sobering than finishing an episode, scrolling down into the comments, only to find a wisecrack from my 4 years younger self. It does look a little funny though. There's a lot of movement, which requires more effort than most things. Usually, anime will hold a character in place and just add a simple zoom effect while their mouth moves. I think I'd need to have majored in something useful to discern what that is, but this fight scene in the first episode just gives me the vibe that something isn't right with it. The larger structure of the anime is an opening scene with Noctis fighting a demon, 4 episodes about each party member, then a return after we find out that this demon also killed Noctis's not mom. There's only one episode that I really want to zero in on. Prompto's episode fixates on how he had 0 friends and lounged around all day eating fast food, simply living in his small world looking at his pictures and doing nothing else, until he gets told by a girl in another country to be Noctis's friend. And the problem with that is that apparently Prompto is too fat to deserve love. Kickstarting a weight loss arc and... oh god. To which Prompto motivates himself by sniffing the letter every goddamn night before running until he deems himself healthy enough to talk to Noctis. Holy shit, do not do that! Listen, if you have to make a major lifestyle change to be someone's pal, you're crazy. That's not how anyone should become friends with anyone. Prompto is lucky that Noctis didn't make him eat bugs or have him paint the guillotine. And Noctis is lucky that Prompto didn't break into his house and smell his underwear. But at least they gave him a gun as a creative outlet. Lord knows if they didn't show up, he might have picked up one anyway. It's a little weird though because, okay, here's the first genuine thing I have to say. I like Prompto. A lot. For one, he's tied to one of my favorite mechanics in the game, period. Throughout your adventure, he'll snap photos and you can save them into a collage. It's a bit burdened by the fact that the game wants me to share these on social media, as if my conservative aunt really wants to see that I climbed the fucking rock of Ravito before getting a girlfriend. What this does do, though, is create a really nice series of events that you can follow and remember just all of the places you might have been to and forgotten about. It's also just really heartwarming. These photos are never perfect, but it's nice to get this side of the characters or to just have something to hold on to. But outside of that, I think Prompto has even more going for him. Prompto is a character that fits into the party in a great way and offers something that Final Fantasy doesn't really reach into much. Prompto is not royal blood. He comes from a small adoptive family in the city of Insomnia. Because of that, he feels insignificant when put next to Gladio and Ignis, who are trained professionals, further reinforced by his low health and emphasis on ranged combat. This makes it hard for him to understand what he's doing, or why he's with these people far away from home. There's this one moment in the game where you stay at some random inn on your travels, only to be greeted with a cutscene on the roof. And the following conversation sucks. It's not clear what on earth he's making things so serious for. You get to see him choke through his feelings and try to push out something genuine. He's also towing the line of not trying to make things awkward even though that point is already past. And it's good. It's good. He opens up on a flaw that most people can understand. This talk with him at the top of the motel doesn't resolve the issue because that's not how people work, but it lets the player understand his motivations, and the fake personality he has built is able to resonate whenever he acts on screen. It's the thing I'm talking about. Ignis does okay when given his own chapter, and Gladio is at least not one-dimensional, but when I think of a fantasy based on reality, grounded characters trying to express their human flaws in a world that pushes them beyond that is what I think of. Because after this stupid fucking motel scene, I started rooting for the guy. I'd see him pull off a cool move and the other guys tell him it's cool and think, bro, that was pretty cool. Well, now I gotta dial things back down to snark and bitterness, otherwise people will think that I'm deceiving them. We see a giant crystal pretty much everywhere we drive. It's apparently a meteor that fell and was caught by a god, the energy of which powers this little hamlet named Lestalem. These are probably 2 of the 5 interesting places on Final Fantasy XV's map. Every town we've seen so far has been 7-Elevens with gas pumps and a trailer outside to sleep in. Also, over 15 people here at a time, but only 2 cars, so I don't know where the hell they came from, how they got here, or where they're going after this. Except there's not really a lot that draws you to be here in Lestallum. It's got no real pizzazz, wow factor, or secrets. I mean, they did host Comic-Con, but you also made me dress up as one of the worst series on Earth. When you walk in, you meet a kid named Talcott and his grandfather, Jared. These are the only 2 real NPCs in the city, but their entire interaction with you here is based on them telling you to go to a dungeon and get a new weapon because no one respects the king. Otherwise, though, this town has got the same commodities as everywhere else. There's a place to sleep, food to eat, and hunts to take. I struggle to imagine someone going, oh, I better get back to Lestallum soon. I want to see the hot ladies in their tinfoil outfits again. Then you meet the coin guy again, whose actual name is Arden. Someone that really the audience should just be a little wary of, but the 4 treat this guy with so much unwarranted caution that it almost gives away the fact that he's the story's 100% major villain. I don't get it. Is it because he talks a little funny? As if everyone they've fucking met so far has had great social skills. There's something really peculiar about this part. All you really end up doing is drive for a bit behind him. He suggests we stay at a hotel and everyone gets all upset as if the screen isn't just gonna fade to black when it happens. Then you drive the next morning and he drops you off without a hitch. What? I think what was originally supposed to happen is that he joins the party as a guest character, and you go on a small quest with him, only to find out that Arden is level 99 and one-shots everything. It's a trick Final Fantasy has used in the past, and it's a great way of bridging story and gameplay while also setting up the power difference between your hero and villain. But no, he just kicks you off on the side of the road near Titan, one of the game's more noteworthy moments. It's not really much of a dungeon. There are these little hotspots that deal almost no damage when you step on him. Then there's the fact that you're limited to Noctis and Gladio, but it's not really about gameplay. Besides a few basic mobs, you're doing quick-time events that can't be failed. You can make a couple of binary choices, but I always choose to act like a little bitch to see Ray Chase pull out those acting chops.
And I'm sick of your endless whining. Calm the hell down.
Get off my back.
You have to live for others, not only yourself.
The Titan fight itself is where the problems are, but before that, I just want to say that this game has no balls at all. I'll step on fire, be attacked by tons of enemies, and get punched by God, and Noctis's health comes back so fast that I don't even need to register the threats at all. It surrounds you with enemy soldiers, it's just that the sole point of this is to press block and counter. Titan even just looks janky because whenever Noctis gets hit by a big enemy, their models clip into each other, or more importantly, the camera. To beat Titan, you have to hold out long enough for Prompto and Ignis to show up, then deal enough damage to trigger a quote-unquote plan. Then you literally make God explode, and then 10 minutes later, Coinmeister comes back to pick you up and drop you off in the middle of nowhere without your car. In practice, it sort of feels like you just get teleported out and dropped right back into the open world. In one of the later updates, they added this cutscene where the gang chats with him to flesh things out, but it's underbaked. They're on an airship, but not like in a room, just the airship. It all takes place in this low-poly gray square, where they all stand around with nothing to say. And thank God they don't, because Lord knows Ignis might let something slip.
Hey, kiddo, I gotta be honest. These Nibelheim guys don't seem to know how to make a real airship. Plus that old 6 million thing. Just can't get behind that. Nah, I know what you're thinking, but I'm not racist. I'm just a little, critical, that's all.
Then you've got these side characters that speak in these awful riddles. Prose that is vague and verbose, only for the game to throw up its hands and say, alright, now go here and kill some things. So I go to a dungeon and hold circle some more and get the Ramuh summon, who will now dominate my life, retrieve my car, come back to Lestallum, and receive some grave news.
They just showed up and then... Poor Jared.
They took Jared behind the shed and killed him like a bad dog. Sorry, I only brought him up in one sentence, so it's okay if you forgot. Jared was an old man just chilling, and they're gonna use him to show how evil the Empire is, and this sparks a revenge arc. No, stop.
Taking matters into hand?
Delivering justice for Jared.
If you told me that someone I served in retail died later that day, it might make me go, oh, life is short. But I would not then break into my local Air Force base! I want to make something clear. The problem isn't that the game is taking an irrelevant dive or swerve. Storytelling arcs usually have this fluffy stage in the center where it diverges into things that don't really relate to the base in hard conflict. Instead, this is the stage where the cast is supposed to grow and change. The bonds get stronger, we get more context. I'm just mad because what kind of setup is this for character growth? We saw Jared for like 5 seconds. Who cares about Jared? Fuck Jared. I hope that Eos has hell so that he can go to it. Because of his ass, I need to do a stealth mission. That's right, Square wanted the whole suite. Crafting, blonde girls in tight pants, and that one thing that defined games in that 2013-2017 era. Tailing missions that instantly give you game over when spotted. Sorry, I'll scream in here this time. This ends with a boss fight against a woman named Aranea Highwind, just so that you know she has 0 self-awareness. A lot of this fight involves using Noctis's warp strike to meet her in the sky for some Dragon Ball Z style combat. Would be a little better if there was some difficulty packed into the Square Enix suite, but hey, wait, I see you double dipping! After this boss fight, we finally got some more time to ourselves, and I think it's a good moment to talk about combat design again. Now we've got 2 summons, Titan and Rama. I know I'm one of those kids who got his creative fills from RPG Maker in high school, but even your little brother could have come up with a better summon mechanic than this. This is walking into the developer room and shrugging your shoulders. Each summon has an invisible set of conditions, where at which a button will appear. You push the button and they come in with their own brand of Agent Orange. These conditions can be Noctis is low on health, to Noctis is near water, to Noctis letting out a gentle sigh of midnight air. In fact, I hate the summons. Midway through one of my many playthroughs, I simply opted to stop using them unless I'm at one of the points in the story where it's forced. Every time I'm having a fight with a little bit of tension, this summon button shows up and the music starts playing, going, do it, and I say, no, I'm finishing this fucking fight my way, shut up! And that goes on for a minute. There's no telling which summon you'll get, but it doesn't matter. They always erase everyone on the field. I killed the final boss with a summon. I didn't save up a cool resource or pull off a nice combat mechanic. Titan just ran in and decked my 70 hours of build-up right in the face. There are several ultimate attacks in the game now that I think about it, and with the inclusion of each one, the term ultimate really does feel a bit flatter, doesn't it? You have the summons that we just talked about, the armor gird that lets you fire random weapons at people. Then there's the ultimate armor gird that gives Noctis a new kit, superpowers, and gear, but disables his friends from fighting. You can plop on literal invincibility armor for a while, and more or less depending on how far your definition goes. Ultimate attacks like this should feel rewarding, but they don't, for a couple reasons. The first is that they don't really feel earned. No matter how much damage you deal, there's no actual proactive steps that you can take to ensure they show up. As for the armor gird, I've never really looked in the bottom left and said, "Aw man, if only I had that ready," because it just charges so naturally. Really, the strongest ability that I do feel like is earned is the Legacy of the Lucii technique that Noctis gets when using the super armor gird. I'm gonna focus on this other ultimate attack though, the armor gird chain, because you don't have to pay for this one. The armor gird chain lets you expend the entire meter so that all of Noctis's friends can come together for one big attack. Except Ignis has an ability just like that I think does more damage, but okay. This chain, IMHO, should be the best attack in the game because it shows all of the friends coming together for one big attack. I love seeing that shit in games. Except like, what attack? What am I seeing here? They're all doing damage, but the attacks aren't landing. There's a lot of things that fuck up the combat system, but there is a bitter core at the center of the gameplay. It's readability. Readability is a hard word to describe, mostly because I just made its meaning up, but I'd say it's how much information the player is given and how comprehensive their courses of actions can be. Like Devil May Cry 5 is really good at keeping the action clean so that you can always be mindful of your options. A lot of the things in Final Fantasy just make looking at the combat a chore. Whether it's the myriad of bushes in the overworld blocking my view to certain attacks not landing when they should, to horrendous visual clutter that gets generated by the user interface. This gets to me even in other games like that Guardians of the Galaxy one. It's pretty and complicated, but it's pretty and complicated all of the time. I think Final Fantasy is okay when you have to fight small enemies like Niflheim Nazis, but goes ass backwards when you have to fight anything slightly larger. The thing about a Chainsaw of Light is that it literally splatters particles all over the map. Any given moment of Final Fantasy XV's combat can be coated in sparkling dust, damage numbers, and the glowing block. Watch how much better the game gets when I snap my fingers and turn off the user interface. Now I'm playing a real E3 level. And yeah, I do like it when developers take risks and reinvent their combat, but when I look at the Final Fantasy XVI trailer and it looks great because of the fiery, sparkling bits coming off of everything, my eyebrows shoot up so fucking high that I could see my future disappointment in the shifts of space-time. Once the E3 magic is gone, we're gonna end up with a completely different beast, and it's gonna look like one too. Not gonna say it'll be a bad game. I consider the Final Fantasy series to still be bursting with potential based on Square's desire to reinvent it, even though sometimes they do baffling shit. Like, look at this new mission they added years after the game came out. It's got new models, a new map, boss fights, full voice acting, Ashley Birch ain't fucking cheap, and it's free! Calm down, I'm not praising Square Enix's generosity, I'm just questioning how this stuff gets greenlit. Well, okay, the free bit is nice. This mission is a crossover between, I don't know, whoever the fuck Sarah over here is and her game I don't know about. To save aliens from an angry alien, it's not important. I just want to know who the target audience for this is. This came out 2 years after the game did, so you still have to hope people have the game installed and kept up with its updates. And it also has to have overlapping fans of 15 and Terra Battle. I googled her name in between this paragraph and the last, don't worry about it. As for the quality, we'll give it a 6. The writing pills around too much and the bond these two makes feel insincere at best, but this final boss is awesome. Looks nice and attacks you with a ton of shadow clones. Plus the atmosphere it's got is fucking amazing. Sarah even comes with her own brand of techniques. Techniques are special abilities that each party member can equip, then used by this meter that charges over time. Realistically, this is the magic system of the game, and the only real strategy unless you count crafting a magic bomb that randomly kills your entire team. I like the technique system since each of the moves are based in the personality of the characters. Gladio can make Noctis and himself invincible for a brief period of time, or drop his greatsword down on an enemy. Prompto can debuff monsters then deal AoE damage, and Ignis can heal the entire party or give Noctis elemental damage. I only really have 2 complaints. The first is that there aren't enough techniques. Each character gets about 5, but these abilities are such a focal point of the combat system that there honestly should have been around 10. I also hate that I can only have 1 equipped at a time. If I think of an actual tactic but don't have the very specific abilities laid out, I gotta run over to the fucking menu and equip new ones. Like I said earlier, enemies have weaknesses to certain weapon types, and these moves are the player's best option to exploit them. I mean, for fuck's sake, Ignis has all 3 attacks that deal elemental damage, and 2 out of the 3 auto-pick in coordination with the enemy's weakness. To shake up the combat, sometimes we get guest party members. At this current moment in time, we are going to have Iris join the party, who's Gladio's younger sister. After Niflheim put down that poor puppy, they realize that Lestalem is no longer safe. The best other space is a place called Cape Kayam, and she needs to ride along. It's great that Iris is in such high spirits, too. It's not like her father was in that city that just exploded. Yeah, he died in that stupid movie I have to talk about later. I could accept that she wasn't there and might not have heard it yet, though could it kill her to be upset that his phone won't pick up? Double for you, Gladio. Iris adds a new ability to combat, throwing out a decoy or slamming herself on the enemy. She'll also run into battle to fully replenish Noctis' MP bar, but it is a little frustrating that no matter what, she'll never go down or run out of health. So you kind of just have to let Iris do her thing rather than actually treat her like a part of the team. This is true for every guest character, to which I count about 4. You'll only keep these characters for about as long as you can care about them, dropping them off after a dungeon or maybe some brunch. Let's catch everyone up to speed on the story. The party has a boat, but it needs to get a special material to actually get it running. Fine, better motivation than fucking Jared. Here's where things get interesting though. Gladio isn't coming with us, and he really won't tell us why or where he's going. So we drive to this dungeon that's underwater and can't get in because it's occupied by the army. Then Aranea shows up and lets us in, even though Noctis was trying to stuff her head where the sun doesn't shine a little bit ago. For what it's worth, this dungeon is pretty. It's just that around now, the problems with the combat have scaled to the point where it's not fun anymore. In this specific playthrough, I've done a total of 3 side quests, so Noctis is now invincible. The enemies don't have complex strategies or movesets that require forward planning, and the tight dark hallways make me feel like I'm being a hostage to the combat rather than an observer. I should also feel like Gladio is missing from the party here. Like everyone's more vulnerable without him taking damage or dealing heavy hits, but I've got items. Damn, big guy, you went through all that work just to get outdone by a can of Monster. This is a good jumping point for the game's bosses, with Quetzalcoatl in particular, namely because it feels like a Game Rant article, redundant and offers nothing to the space it's in. Quetzal Pretzel is a health sink. You just kind of push buttons till he dies. Push buttons. See, was that really the best you could do? Fine, you hold dodge, attack, and then hit the technique button after a while. Happy? I can Game Rant too. I think a good boss fight in an RPG should base itself around some specific mechanic. Maybe it has some really strong status effect that it passes out, or creates drones that shoot at you so you have to watch 2 angles at once. But this fight is just about taking bites while also holding dodge if you think you should. I can forgive it for being easy. I draw the line because it's forgettable. This is a really cool moment in the context of the plot. Noctis and Aranea are bridging the gap, working together across enemy lines. But this event sticking with the player is dependent on how emotionally invested they are in the level itself. Surrounding details aren't enough. You need to engage. The only thing that really tuned me into this context was a stray, albeit kind of sweet, interaction during combat.
Are you hurt?
You're always this kind to enemies?
No, but I am to my allies.
This is where the boss comes in. If there was a poignant moment that cemented this level, I think people would be more willing to crack it open. Quetzalcoatl is a simple fight, and I dealt with him in under 2 minutes. I never had to glean in closer, or play any differently than any other battle in 15. Final Fantasy is trying so hard to keep things flat to appeal to a larger crowd. It's just that this is not how art should work. Most of the big banger stories I've consumed are usually geared at a certain type of person. Specificity is what makes it more appealing. And I'm not against accessibility, but I think there's a difference between making it so that games can be played by anyone and making a game that is for everyone. Colorblind options, subtitle customization, it's all great. I was even able to play Uncharted 4 with my mom because of its assist mode. However, Uncharted 4 still has some teeth in its default difficulties and it ensures that you stay engaged. There was a reason that I decided to dedicate an entire section to this dungeon, because it's the only one worth talking about. The others are just walking through caves. Sometimes they have wacky moments in them, but those are far and few between, and most of the time don't make a point. But this one was onto something. And I wish that, like, I don't know, all of the rest of the systems weren't here to bog it down. After this dungeon, Gladio comes back with a scar and a don't talk about it. How mysterious, and like all good mysteries, you can find out the truth by paying $7.99 on the PlayStation Store. Remember when I referred to Final Fantasy XV's release as an event? That was very true. However, alongside the finale, we also heard that they greenlit Season 2 and 3. Each of the DLCs in this game center on one of the party members during critical moments when they go missing. The goal being to develop them in a heartfelt way that the story can't do because of its focus on Noctis. Think of it as in-depth therapy for a stranger. Gladio's DLC is about him training with the obligatory Matt Mercer character as he goes down a linear path hitting things with his linear sword. The plot being that he is going through a trial specifically designed for those sworn to be the King's Shield. And the catalyst for this was that he was thrown back by someone, making him feel insignificant. So he's got to go into this chasm to validate his emotions, which involves a lot of picking up pillars and smashing them onto enemy heads. Gladio does have a very different style of combat to Noctis. He plays like a simple brawling character. Each attack you land builds up a special attack meter, which can drop a bigger finishing move the more you let it charge up. Starting with a small slam, then a sweeping move, ending in a complicated flurry that will end any fight it's used in. Blocking also introduces a damage multiplier. The more perfect parries you land, the stronger returns you'll make when attacking back. And thankfully, after all 3 episodic DLCs were released, you can actually swap to him mid-combat during the base game. The end of the trial, Gilgamesh, is really cool too. It takes place on probably the most distinct setup for any fight on Eos. Not that it really had much to compete with, but battling someone while surrounded by the swords of every person who's fallen before him just adds so much. You do feel as though you're going up against overpowering odds, made worse through his extremely strong hits, and your limited healing capabilities. Except you are also entirely capable of beating him. To which he will give Gladio a great sword that carries across save files. But the real reward comes after you beat him and Gladio goes, "I am a massive piss baby. Wow, I lay on the ground and cry and cry and cry and cry." So a lot of this DLC is an attempt to vindicate Gladio as a character and give him more depth. Gladio always felt like the simplest character in the room. The only trait that I find mildly interesting is that he doesn't blindly follow Noctis, but instead wants to push him to fulfill his role, usually resulting in Gladio being an asshole. Outside of that, he's got some quirks, but he acts very single-mindedly. If he's really that anxious about getting knocked back once, he should have a deep-seated grudge against every Garula we've faced. That said, it's not a bad story. I liked it for the most part. It finally has some focus, the updated UI is pretty, and controls fairly gracefully. It even solves the problem from the main game where your strongest attacks feel unearned. And now you'll start to see a major point about this game. The DLCs are good, very good. The writing is a lot more character-centric and keeps the goals simple. Fight Gilgamesh, sate your ego. I mean, it's better than Gladio's personal in-game side quest where you have to make the perfect cup of noodles because one person simping for the college experience wasn't enough. The quest itself is just go here and harm the ecosystem, but the gross corporate overlord lens that I'm sponsoring myself to sponsor my dinner is just a feeling that I can't get over. And I don't think I'm the only one who gets a weird feeling. Listen to this line by the voice actor and tell me he doesn't sound sarcastic.
Any food you make tastes better when you use good ingredients, right? Then, if you take something already delicious like cup noodles and add in the finest, freshest ingredients, what do you get? The ultimate flavor experience.
You know what? It's just occurred to me that now there's an ad for cup noodles in my video. I'm gonna fix that. I hate cup noodles. The broth is plasticky and fake, the carrots have the texture of a month-old toenail, and no matter how much I cook the water, the noodles always feel stiff. Get yourself a pack of instant ramen, same price but better noodles, and you have essentially got a blank slate for whatever you want. Like, I add sesame oil, green onions, and a couple cracks of black pepper, and it's awesome. Now we are faced with a choice. Once we use the pretzel monster's MacGuffin to repair this boat, we can sail to Altissa, the place we were heading to at the start of the game, and we're not coming back. Instead of simply dropping a grade on us with the open world, Final Fantasy sort of funnels downward, getting more linear as we go. This was something that upset a lot of people, but I think it's a good decision creatively speaking. It effectively splits the game into two halves. The first where everything goes well, the characters bond, and a half where everything does not. And we'll get there, but first I want to touch on the open world portion of EOS to the point where I feel satisfied, even though I am almost certainly going too fucking far. From this point on, we can go pretty much anywhere on the map and do every side quest except for a few endgame bosses that are locked till you beat the final chapter. You want to know what I did with this freedom? I walked all the way across the map. With my legs. It was a little iffy as to where the longest walk in the game is, but I picked the Royal City checkpoint and then wandered to the Vesper Pool again. The reason as to why I did this in the first place was to see if there was anything actually interesting, hidden areas I didn't know about, or some environmental storytelling. Well, okay, before I did this I struck out with Cindy twice, because did you really think I'd make a video like this if I wasn't irreparably single? Not only is the world of EOS not particularly threatening considering the circumstances, but it's also just fucking boring. I'd occasionally see a larger demon at night, but the only real random encounter I had was Aranea jumping in to help out with a stronger fight. The ensuing brawl was kind of cool, but despite the warnings from other characters, demons aren't a threat that should be taken seriously, as I can always warp past them. Otherwise, the walk consisted of a lot of dialogue. Most of it fine, like, ugh, this sun sucks, and, yeah. Maybe this is similar to walking in a Far Cry world. Perhaps most games just don't have what it takes to fill an entire planet with interesting things, but the sheer size of EOS makes that tedium all the harder to get through, taking me roughly an hour and 45 minutes of real-world time to get to my destination. As someone with a lot of tolerance for boredom, I made it a point to write down the bit where I got bored. Here it was. You can see Noctis stopping cause I wanted to yawn real quick. Here's where it gets at its worst because of this one tunnel that connects a large portion of the map. Christ, why did I do this? And I even got downed by a level 17 enemy as they have a special counter move for that. If I glean through the 500 pieces of UI, I might see it coming, but there's no telling if my AI-controlled partners will. You might be wondering why I haven't spoken about the Regalia yet, the shining jewel in Final Fantasy XV's marketing. Everything was about this fucking car. Everything. You know what I did in this car? Spin the camera around and look at things. At least when I do it, my passengers freak out on me. There's no racing, car combat, conversations or dialogue trees outside of, do you like coffee, Ignis? For what I can tell, the Regalia is here for no reason other than that walking is a worse alternative, and to make sure that the player can see the open world. I can almost feel the game glaring at me when I press the fast travel button, as it takes 5 complimentary cents for my arrogance. It's better than breaking down, where Noctis has to push the car. You might think this would fade to black or something like it does in the opening, but it really is just you pushing the car in silence. So instead, I just pay 100 to have it warp to the starting town, then press the return to car button. While in the starting town, I can pay the local big busty mechanic to button up her shirt. No, I don't need you to email me the receipt, I've got cash. You'd think my wallet was going dry, but I just sold the guy at Speedway random bits Gladio sculpted off some corpses. Now the Regalia can go off-road, which always gets it stuck or makes it jiggle around like it's Cindy. It can also fly if you want to die. I guess the royal tutors also forgot to tell the prince that if you don't know how to fly a plane, you shouldn't buy a fucking plane. I don't think the Regalia needed more modes of transportation. What it needed was something to tether it to the actual way you interact with 15's world. Realistically, the only things you can do in the car is buy stuff and turn on the radio.
Come zone.
But it should have been more of a moving anchor, a place that you are always waiting to return to as it marks the only familiar thing you have in a strange world. This is a really basic suggestion that might be flawed to how this game wanted to roll, but I really would have liked it if you only could have saved when standing in front of the car. It would have made the Regalia the start and the end of each of your sessions playing the game. Then put a lot of random conversations that flesh out the cast as they drive from point to point, determine which one will play by the distance the car is driving, and also make those conversations trigger once a game to avoid Spider-Man syndrome. To bring things back to the open world, the side quests in this game suck. Not just because the side cast is the worst, but because doing them actively hurts your ability to enjoy the game. Final Fantasy XV lays out what you should be doing and at what level you should be doing it. Remember how I said Golden Key is where players will find the best combat balancing? That's because you will outpace what the game is expecting your level to be, and it'll happen fast. For some reason, after 300 updates, they never chose to add in a hard mode. Want to play on New Game Plus so you can keep all your abilities? Well, they don't update the levels of the enemies, so I hope you like one-shotting 90% of them. I really do think a notice came down from Square Enix that said the campaign needed to be completed with 0 side questing because people find side quests boring if forced upon them. A decision I find really unfortunate. Well, okay, only kind of. Most of the side quests were not worth seeing to their end. Let me break them down into categories because I like doing that. Hunts, blue quests, crossovers, and royal tombs. Hunts are small kill quests. I don't bother with them for the same reason why I don't put the dishes back in the sink after I clean them. I've already fought most of the enemies on display, but there are some rare monsters who need to get sponged down. Blue quests instantly get thrown out unless I was being glared at by a passing commenter. Then there are the 2 crossover quests, like the one with Sarah from earlier, the other being a crossover with Final Fantasy XIV. It's unremarkable mostly. The cat thing they make you hang out with is really unappealing, and the music sounds like I'm being waterboarded by a chorus of 12-year-olds with tubas. Also platforming, which makes me want to break my legs so that Gladio can do it for me. Then, this ungodly part where you have to spot shit with binoculars. Can we stop putting this in games? There are no other hints other than find something interesting. Here's something interesting, your lighting engine is screwed. Okay, I'm being unfairly condescending because I'm not willing to give you enough context to explain the whole plot of the quest. There's a reason I'm showing this to you though. There is a pretty major inclusion in the form of Garuda, a new summon and really cool boss fight. It moves at a fast pace, but it also keeps itself focused without overwhelming you. It looks distinct. You gotta dodge tornadoes or the living winds she creates. I was also the right level to do this, meaning that afterwards playthrough number 4 was doomed to join the 90% revolution. Oh, what's that? No matter how hard I fight this boss, it doesn't matter because you're gonna force a summon halfway that instantly kills it? Thanks. Maybe I should have kept my fucking mouth shut. I didn't forget the categories. There's one more type of side quest we gotta talk about. One of the better ways to spend your free time is by raiding royal tombs. These are places where Noctis's ancestors have been buried alongside a royal arm, a special weapon that has its own brand and effects. For example, the Sword of the Wise will instantly warp you to the enemy you want to attack. The Sword of the Mystic gives you a damage buff after a combo, and finally the Sword of the Tall, which is actually just a chainsaw made out of light. Getting these weapons will feel exciting at first because every other tool in Noctis's pocket dimension has been operating in the exact same way ever since you got the first one in its family. One of the game's defining traits is the amount of customization Noctis has. And no, I'm not talking about the fucking noodle hat. There's an emphasis on Noctis swapping out his weapons, which, yeah, he has a lot of them. Pretty much every weapon in the game can be wielded by him. Except something that most people probably don't know is that the only things that trigger the high damage Link strikes are great swords, pole arms, and doing their best swords. Nor is this a particularly frame data intensive game that demands you balance Noctis's juggle with his wave dash, realistically leaving you with a bunch of these same weapons except for weaknesses and their effective range. These attacks could have been a way to expand Noctis's arsenal and give him a ton of unique properties. Well, at least if they didn't falter in the face of Final Fantasy XV's larger problems. Their effects are paper thin and get lost in the splatterhouse. I bet most people didn't even know the Sword of the Mystic gives you a damage buff after swinging because they're probably trained to recognize it as the weapon that shoots projectiles when warp striking. What begrudges me a lot more is the fact that the cost for using the Royal Arms is losing your health, not your MP. Final Fantasy XV's health system is already annoying enough, layering 2 health bars on top of each other when really one was just fine. I get that it's realistic. If you stab me, the initial wound will staunch, but there's still a hole there. Draining from your health is very confusing from a gameplay standpoint. But I can hazard a guess as to why it is the way it is. When designing the game, a core part of controlling Noctis in combat would be divvying out his MP, either by dodging or warping, forcing fights to pace themselves as a weak Noctis would have to scramble for cover or hang from a warp point. Big fucking problem! You have to really mess up to get Noctis into his stasis mode. The recharge is fast enough to let you hold on without worry, and as a cherry on top of the cake, warping to a point instantly replenishes Noctis' MP, making this whole system pretty much redundant. When Square Enix realized that MP was becoming a non-issue, they still needed him to think about using his coolest weapons to keep them feeling sexy, so they opted for draining his health instead because that resource is harder to recover, in theory. And it really sucks because I could tell that they once had a good battle system, but it got progressively painted over so many times that it lost sight of itself. I would have just cut out the combat system's problem at the source by nerfing warp points, that and reduce the amount of weapons to just include the sword and royal arms, then dump in a bunch of new techniques to add depth, followed by making the royal arms drain from your MP, while also doing something about all those goddamn ether potions I got stocked up. But now I'm shadowboxing my own theory, so let's move on. As a gesture of goodwill towards the few Final Fantasy fans that haven't begun searching my address, a lot of that complaining is about to stop. We're done with EOS, actually. Yep. Once we're past this point, we will leave the open world and not come back in any canon capacity. We're going to Altissia. Altissia, I don't fucking know which one it actually is. I'm flipping behind, and by going, I mean actually going across the water. I'd want to tell you this is a waste of time, but it's actually neat pacing, and I'm kind of surprised they rendered all of this blue. Hell, the game gets better from here on out, visually speaking. I mean, Conan O'Brien liked it. Look how happy he is.
Why would someone play this? Why would someone play this game?
Altissia is a marvel because it's got a culture to it. Not by an insane amount. Everyone in this city is still operating off of half-dead batteries from the TV remote, but there's enough energy to be noticed. Based off of Venice, Italy, Altissia is a city based entirely on the water. Water streets, older brickwork technology, it's nice to be here. After dredging alone the barren wastelands of EOS, it's great to see the game given some focus. You're in a city, for Christ's sake. And there's so much to do, like walking and walking and walking, and oh god damn it. Yeah, just like the city is based off of, Altissia is very pretty, but the water underneath is all raw sewage. I've seen more to do in the laundromat. I get that it's a city, so there really shouldn't be a lot of combat, but the attractions are far and few between. Oh, let's look at Luna Freya's dress. Are you jerking me around or something? At least I got to see which race of monsters is superior in a Darwinian competition for crap prizes. Most of this Altissia level is just learning to traverse it through gondolas. The system is a confusing series of lines that give me a headache just looking at it. Like we've come out of upstate New York into the city and don't understand the subways yet. It'd actually be a sobering moment, as you would feel just as confused as if you moved to a new town. If it wasn't for the fact that Altissia just had no bite to it. When I went to New York City and had to learn the subways, at least my ears got attacked by a naked man and his flute. I can drive this giant boat around the open ocean from before too. And for the 100th time, the game puffs a gross breath on my back that says, I would like it if you played the fishing minigame. There are some neat random events like these photos. I tried to go near this island because it's important to the plot later, and this happens.
Hold on. Get us out of here, Iggy. Right.
Hang in there. Who are you?
What is it? I don't know. Apparently it hurt Noctis, but not so bad that he didn't feel like taking a selfie with it. Here's the other thing. You only have 2 quests here in Altissia. Go to Lee, go to the hotel, turn around to talk to Hillary Clinton. Then the open streets of Altissia are also gone. In all of the playthroughs I've done, this hurts me. This giant monolithic thing that took years to build. Gone. I just feel this weird void in my soul, similar to the one when I'm editing my videos. I guess while I did bring up the fishing minigame, I have to mention that I have failed somewhere down the road. Final Fantasy XV, Monster of the Deep, is a VR game where you fish. I don't have VR. Guess who's not spending more money than his video is gonna make? This guy. That's why I'm introducing a token system. I'm gonna hold on to 2 for later, but one I'm spending on episode Carnbunkle, a manga about the rat from the Platinum demo. Artistically, Altissia is like Venice, but politically it's like Hong Kong. It's legally owned by the Empire, but it's allowed to set its own rules and pretend it's not actually the other's bitch. Here rests Leviathan, one of the 6 gods that we need to befriend in order to progress. The elephant in the room is that Leviathan is a pain in the ass and everyone sort of knows it. So, upon waking it up, which I have to do for some reason, it's gonna destroy this nice pretty city, meaning that Noctis has to beat it up until everything is okay. He may then proceed to kiss his girlfriend, who is here too for some reason. The thing is, the people of this city don't really like the idea of being the next Tiananmen Square. Not that they really know this is gonna happen, or that their government discussed it with Pretty Boy, and accepted that their lives are on the line. No, if the story pretended the world existed outside of the immediate party, something realistic might happen. To negotiate and minimize the damage, Noctis has to deal terms in this branching conversation path. Examining this kind of thing means to examine a whole different kind of game together, but I want to do it anyway. The goal here is to convince this woman that we are capable and act in a manner befitting a king. Really, the outcome here is irrelevant. She will always agree to support you no matter what happens. She'll just give you less collectible ass pennies if you're mean to her. What mostly bothers me is the simpleton language and dialogue options you're given in this moment. For example, the first three we get are pry into private affairs, probe knowledge, or express gratitude. Who on earth would pick these two? Am I fucking Alex Eagleston? Of course you express gratitude. The problem is in the language. People tend to want good outcomes in choice-based games, so they will often assess the words used in the options and search for the one with the most positive association. Every option is some extension of this. Find the one that doesn't sound mean and choose it. To get the best score, Noctis has to roll over like a good puppy for this lady. You can't negotiate your way into smashing your girlfriend, you can't negotiate any extra help during the fight, you aren't even debating. You just give her what she wants. How much more interesting would this have been if the grounds were uneven? You had knowledge she doesn't, or you need something she won't readily give up. I'm not saying this has to become a bread tube debate, but really, if your brain just searches for positive words in the options, you can caveman all the way to the best result. And that's all you do in Altissia. Meet one guy at a bar, then do this boring conversation. Afterwards, Leviathan shows up and erases the whole city. Buildings get swallowed up by waves, several explosions level hundreds of people's workplaces, and 6 whole Imperial troopers get stabbed by me. Could you imagine if there was a dungeon here, or a royal tomb, and you spent time engaging with this city, learning its rules for a bit? Not enough to love it as much as home, but enough to understand what is getting destroyed? The fight against Leviathan is what most people remember about Altissia. You're alone and encased in this giant arena with several floating buildings to warp onto. Leviathan will slam into them and break them, reducing your options, and you'll be warping all over the place to keep Noctis out of harm's way. The spectacle of the fight is ruined by 2 things. One, Leviathan is so fucking big that the camera snaps its neck when you lock onto it. It's the same problem most of the fights in 15 have, but Leviathan is much bigger and is constantly flying, whipping around, and exacerbating the problem. The second is that you don't really get to engage with the actual mechanical fight for very long. About halfway through, a small cutscene triggers, which causes Noctis to go tryhard mode. In this, you can dodge or fire particle effects that explode. It's pretty to watch, certainly, at least when you've turned off all those stupid damage numbers, but it's so simple that the battle of man versus creator gets boiled down to who could press circle harder. Here, Leviathan falls and gives Noctis her blessing and then possibly an apology to all of the lives she just destroyed. Don't worry, Prince, you'll have to do yours soon too. Hold on, I'm not done here. I didn't mention why Noctis gains that new power. Altissia is the centerpiece of one of the game's side characters, Lunafreya Nox Fleury, Noctis' wife-to-be and one of the most storied characters in Final Fantasy's development. At first there was a bad bitch here, then Luda popped up and replaced her, but don't worry, Nomura is still scheming up his revenge on that, just you fucking wait. See, Luna and Noctis are, in a way, childhood friends. They were right there at the start and looked at a book together instead of doing something that real children would do. Luna's home then gets a real internet connection and the two never see each other again, opting instead to keep in touch by swapping back and forth that book with notes written in it, and nothing bad happened there. Don't tell me after all these years, Noctis never traced the outline of something he shouldn't have and shipped that. Even then, they have so much space on these pages, yet every single one is the size of a bad Tinder message. No, but really, this is a fantasy based on reality, except it's refusing all of the good parts of reality. These two are set up as a pairing by destiny. They don't really disagree on anything. Hell, I don't even really know what they like about each other outside of their handwriting. People are not always perfect for each other, but their differences make them drawn to one another anyway. So when Luna sacrifices herself for Noctis, oh, right, Luna sacrifices herself for Noctis, and he falls into a deep depression as a result, I don't feel it. I don't feel any of it. Noctis misses Luna, but the player has never had a chance to care about her, so it fails to help us sympathize with his mourning. And it creates an interesting juxtaposition. After the Leviathan fight, Noctis wakes up in bed and is given the news of her passing. But despite this moment being given a lengthy, high-budget cutscene, I'm sure more people remember what comes next. Ignis sitting there with a massive scar over his eyes and decaying, having been permanently blinded in the battle over the city. A weight that Noctis and the player have to carry without knowing what exactly... Oh, right. Episode Ignis is the third of the main game DLCs, but chronologically it has its moment here in Altissia. After Noctis beats up Leviathan and Luna gets her new dick pic in Hell, someone has to get them off that rock in the middle of nowhere. Ignis has a much clearer playstyle than Noctis. He has 3 elements to switch between, each with scenarios that benefit them. If you equip the fire daggers, you can focus damage on one target, while the ice daggers deal area of effect damage, and the lightning daggers always close the gap between Ignis and his target. Each attack also increases the damage you deal, but most importantly, you can charge up a clarity meter in the bottom right for a special attack corresponding to what dagger you have equipped. Noctis can summon a god, but he'll never have an attack that feels as good as this. Triggering a full clarity attack is rewarding because you felt like you planned ahead. Ignis needs to charge this up by being vulnerable. It doesn't come like everything else that pampered fuck gets. You can make it even better by storing it and landing enough attacks so that it does double, triple, or quadruple damage. I really like it. You know what happens next though? The game has the balls to walk up to me and say, Accordo is under attack. Protect and claim territory from the Empire. What is this, Final Fantasy 15, a new empire for mobile phones everywhere? Here, since this video is bloated, 1 month from now you'll find a special DLC video in the description. But for what it's worth, Episode Ignis also has some decent storytelling. I'd even call it above average. In the base campaign, Ignis was my least favorite character. He's a snobby, intelligent guy that offers plans like those 4 stealth sections, as well as thrusting a crafting mechanic onto me so that I can pretend I care about cooking. Most of all though, I think he lacked any real drive or internal strife. Gladio is just as placid, but he's got his little sister and a side job as an Instagram person with terrible takes. Prompto always comes off as vulnerable, and well, okay, Noctis still kind of wanders around and stumbles into walls, but Ignis existed in this bubble where his actions came from an unforeseeable amount of calm intelligence. He sees this story as his birthright duty and is a lot less excitable about it than the others. This DLC doesn't give him anything new, but it does take the core premise of what little he was given and turns it into something special. All Ignis wants is to keep Noctis safe, and it's heartwarming to see that bond transcend being just his job. We get to see him meet foils, get perspective of what he cares about, and see what happens when the character is put to his deepest limits. You also finally get to have some combat in this city. The Empire has taken over certain sections and you have to reclaim them. There was no real reward for doing these as far as I could tell, but it's content. By the way, it cracks me up a bit as to how this episode has a lavish menu of its own, but nothing to do in it. You could swap your gear, but every option is grayed out, and I never found a way to change that. We even meet this Ravis guy and have him join the party. Best of all, he's a general of the Niflheim army, so you combine him in that earlier interaction with Aranea, and I'd like to say that Ignis is officially not racist anymore. But more so, Ravis and Ignis have a pretty interesting parallel to one another based on their positions in the world. Ravis is Luna's older brother. After King Regis abandoned their home to be taken over, Ravis worked his way up the ranks of the Niflheim army to secure a position that would allow him to protect Luna, similar to how Ignis was appointed by Noxus' father. However, Ravis carried a bitterness to the powers around him, and when Luna dies, that explodes into a carnivorous hatred. Ignis, on the other hand, placed his faith in the people in his life, so when things got rough, he was able to stay determined. But maybe the bigger truth is that Ignis is just too lucky to see that he could have ended up like Ravis in another life. Though the biggest comparison is their ultimate fate, driven by their desire to protect their charges. So there's this MacGuffin called the Ring of the Lucii in Final Fantasy 15. It's handled pretty poorly by the main game, being a powerful magical artifact that represents Noctis' inability to become a king. Other characters ferry it around for most of the timeline, and we don't ever really get a glimpse into what it can do until the very end. In my opinion, it should have been in the player's possession at the start, as a more down-to-earth gameplay to story metaphor, which might have once been a thing, but I'm getting off track. This ring does have one other trick to it. Other people can wield the ring as well, gaining that power of a king for a brief time. The problem being is that the ring doesn't really like to be put on by people who aren't kings, usually taking back from the person who puts it on. The final boss of episode Ignis is Arden, who, still wiping Luna's blood off of his knife, offers Ignis a deal, which he of course refuses, and then Ignis puts on the Ring of the Lucii to fight him, irrevocably burning his eyes in the process. The fight goes on for a while, but you can't actually win. Instead, Arden fucks off for no reason in particular, and Ignis falls over, not being able to tell that he's landed right next to Noctis. And it's not a fake out. Ignis is blind now. He no longer fights like the calculated person that was always running up to Noctis in combat. He staggers around. You can't use his techniques anymore or get a random health item thrown your way. Sometimes he might toss a lucky knife and it'll land, but there's no coming back for him. And it's fucking sad. Unless you choose to... No, stop! I'm gonna wait to talk about the other ending of episode Ignis, because the alternate ending is also the end of Final Fantasy XV's main story. I'm protecting you as far as I'm aware. What I'm going to talk about instead is the DLC's optional boss fight. Each of the three features an extra tough boss battle at the end. Gladio faced Cole. Prompto versed his waifu bait, but Ignis's is titled Friendly Spar. Huh.
Since when are you my sparring partner?
And the loser will eat all his vegetables.
Oh, okay. Holy Christ, this took me like 5 tries. The Noctis boss fight is from hell. I'm making sure I write this right after doing it so that I can capture the raw fervent state that this goddamn freshman dweeb drew out of me. Nothing you do hits this guy. He either phases through it or blocks it with his shield. You cannot reliably expect to land any combos on Noctis. You only have a handful of attacks that can do anything, and they're all frustrating. To beat Noctis, you have to force him to dodge enough so that he enters stasis, meaning that you can actually hit the fucker. Except this takes forever. I attack and I attack and I attack, but nothing changes. When he finally does go down for a bit, he warps and instantly recovers all his MP. I told you it was busted! The alternative is to hit him with the high jump attack, which can hurt him, but half the time Noctis might do a somersault and recover half of the damage you dealt. The best use for this is to take advantage of the invincibility frames it gives you. The last and most efficient method is to pull out the electric blades. These make Ignis move fast enough so that he doesn't get pummeled by all the shit landing around him. Also, if you shock him once, you can charge up the clarity to perform an electric attack that lands no matter what. Then Noctis pulls out the fucking ring that scared him so much before and uses it to suck the life out of you. Friendly Spar my ass. Worst is when he casts Alterna, which kills you no matter what happens. Your only option is to stun him while he's triggering it, but if you're downed or using a healing item, tough shit. Every time I lost, it was to one of these 2 attacks. But I did it. I beat him with almost nothing, and goddammit, screw you, I'm glad your girlfriend's dead, you goddamn cheating little... So here we have reached the pure linear parts of Final Fantasy XV. Ignis is fried and the right brand of Arizona is sold out. The gang, having to abandon their original plan, well, one of their original plans, decide to get on a train straight to Niflheim and do things the old-fashioned way. We are heading out of the lush fields of Lucis to the more dim desert grounds of Niflheim, with a lot of forced stops, like this one in Cartanica. So this part has a lot of stuff I like and some things I dislike. For one, I think this branch of the game's world is way more interesting and compelling, and the pacing is slowed down to really help you take in the low moment that Cartanica represents in the story. At this point in time, one of the core party members is seriously hurt. Gladio thinks Noctis has to nut up and grind his way through his feelings to accept what he has to do, but Noctis is still miserable about Luna or whatever. From Gladio's point of view, it's his duty to make him wake the hell up. And to be honest, this kind of hurts to watch. There's a lot to take in, and to the game's credit, I think it's hard to not feel the atmosphere. There's even some really neat ways the game sells that feeling without using cutscenes. For example, Ignis would always serve you pretty looking food at camp, and in lieu of that, you could always eat something nice at a restaurant. Except his injuries mean that you will have to settle for canned beans or instant ramen. If you thought you could escape to a restaurant, no dice either, because the vapid and sour state of the Empire ensures that the best you'll find is middle school cafeteria food. It even goes the extra mile by making the player wander the train as if they're Noctis trying to escape an awkward tension that they don't know how to solve. In this part, the party needs to make their way into a tomb and find another royal arm. Here's where I think they did some stuff that doesn't really work. To once again emphasize Ignis's injuries, Noctis cannot stray too far away from the party while they help him walk, otherwise he'll be scolded, disarming me from my chief means of locomotion. But it's never really certain as to how far is too far.
Is it too much to ask the royal procession sticks together?
It's a lot of trial and error to find the right distance, which is compounded by the fact that this is the most open dungeon there is. Cartanica ends up feeling like one of the weirder levels because it's something more like a circle. The goal is to power this ancient machine in the center so that you can access the boss room, though I kept turning around and getting lost. Yes, very Zelda-like, except they never had the almighty waypoint in Hyrule. But if the layout was too confusing, I think we're close enough to Niflheim to Google the solution. The boss here is a Malboro. It's a large monster with poison attacks and the ability to spawn littler versions of itself. Based on how I described it, this would be the inverse of the Quetzalcoatl fight, right? Yeah, alright, I could give it that. I still remember how this moment feels, and I can attribute part of that to this boss fight. There's an air of desperation hanging around. It's muddy, dingy, and miserable. Everyone's slowly losing health, and the monster is an ugly, gnarled mesh of roots. There is one problem. Yeah, I take it back. The fight is unwinnable. Not in that it's overpowered, but in that the Marlboro will fill up its health meter again and again until you run away from it. Once you get to the other side of the arena, Ignis will come up with a new ability called Libra Elementia, which lets him scan an enemy's weakness, then cast a spell they're vulnerable to. This allows you to kill the boss and grab the Royal Katana. Here, Ignis breaks the silence and tells the gang that he has the resolve to go through with things, and even if he's wrong, he'd rather try than turn back. The loading screen says that this restores harmony to the group, but other than everyone talking again, I'm still not all that happy. Which is nice, it's not waving away a very serious story moment in an unrealistic bout of talk no jutsu. The gameplay is changed slightly as Ignis is given 2 basic attacks again, a stab that lowers the enemy's stats, and a counter pose which lets him deal real damage again. From here on, we get some set pieces. I've always remembered enjoying this part in which it's just Noctis and Prompto against a wave of Imperial suicide jihadists trying to take down the train. I would maybe leverage the criticism that it's over a little too quickly for me to feel that 2-man camaraderie, but it's not bad because then it swaps to an aerial battle where you need to teleport from floating ships and destroy them quickly. Then comes Arden, the trickster antagonist that never seems all that clever. Sure, he's gonna fuck things up, but without any rhyme or reason. Arden's powers are unexplained and can kind of do literally anything that the plot needs him to do, but I guess it's not a Mary Sue if it's the antagonist. These powers include all of Noctis's royal arms, but also stopping time and creating complex illusions, something that he uses to confuse Noctis into attacking Prompto and sending him off the train and out of the party. Episode Prompto drops right in after this happens, with Prompto getting captured and placed inside this giant fortress in the middle of a tundra. Here the player gets to swap to a fighting style based on guns as they break out. Prompto can circle around enemies and shoot at them. Then, once they're staggered, you can fire off a crack shot to do massive damage. You can do a lot of really cool dives and dashes that shoot at the same time, but Prompto can also pick up guns from the environment for you to use. Be that a machine gun, rocket launcher, or sniper rifle if you really didn't want to play a Final Fantasy game. It's possible that throughout this video, you'll notice that I tend to swap to Prompto a lot, and that's not because of how much I want to top him. Prompto has his own brand of techniques, with a ton of high-level attacks that charge while I play Noctis. So, sub him in, use Trigger Happy, then swap back to Noctis. Sometimes I'll change to Ignis because his meter does the same thing, but his strongest technique has a 50% chance of failing, so I do it a lot less. If I were to rank the DLCs, it'd be in ascending order ever since they came out. Episode Prompto is not lukewarm like Gladio's, but it's not truly satisfying like Ignis is. And that's for a few reasons. Following a small breakout sequence, you obtain a motorcycle and get to roam the mountains, a map that is barren like everything else in this game. I guess when you're in development for so long, it's natural to expect menopause to show up. You can speed around or do optional encounters if you want the thrill. There's no leveling up or exciting items to find. Really, Prompto is doing this because he has really bad self-esteem. It does have a nice boss fight as Prompto faces a giant monkey that climbs around. It feels awe-inspiring as you do it, plus you get to work in tandem with RNA while picking up a bunch of weapons and circling around its giant attacks. It's a really cool piece of DLC, with a lot of variety and interesting character moments. The thing keeping episode Prompto back is, in my opinion, its twist. Prompto has always been a character about not belonging. He has no special training, and honestly, he's a bit of their punching bag. It's relatable in this down-to-earth way. I think a lot of people can relate to being in Prompto's situation, the one that doesn't feel like they match up to the people around them, so they act out and exude a lot of energy to make up for that lacking. And the goal of episode Prompto is to try and find that relatability and undo it as hard as possible. The twist is that Prompto is actually a clone created by Niflheim and was meant to be one of the several disposable ironclad soldiers that I've been wiping the floor with all game, meaning that he is not actually a born citizen of Lucis and was created to be actively fighting against his friends, which raises a few questions. One, why did the Empire want an army of pretty blonde boys? Surely that wouldn't make it past the elevator pitch. Second, am I really expected to believe that the only one of these guys to escape and live a normal life is also the only person in the world that ends up being Noctis's genuine friend? This should be the story where Prompto learns to value himself as a person, gets some self-respect. Instead, the main drama is whether or not the others will turn on him for what he is, making the conflict outward instead of inward. The main problem is how the game treats this revelation, putting us in a nightmare sequence where Prompto flees Noctis, and in his defense, that guy can be quite scary when you're not the one controlling him. Though, would it have killed for this to be about Prompto dealing with it? They even sort of address this. This twist makes him less relatable and focuses the fucking guy's concern about his goddamn parasocial relationship with Noctis. I can forgive it since episode Prompto's story holds its own with some cool imagery, but in relation to the game on the other side of the umbilical cord, it doesn't help. Plus, it gets Noctis to admit that if he was king, he would insist on using his guillotine to force globalization onto Eos.
Once this is all over, I say we break down the borders. Come together as one nation.
Meanwhile, in the regular game, the rest of the gang is really shaken up. Unrelated to Prompto, we're going to Tenebrae. This is the home to Lady Lunafreya, and it's doing pretty good. Except I have no clue why they even brought us here. You don't do a dungeon, watch a major character revelation, or even have a moment where we set foot inside the castle, probably because Noctis is afraid of Gladio finding his old art. There is a flashback where we find out that what Luna wanted was to marry Noctis too. However, it falls under the pitfall that I'm happy Luna didn't get what she wanted. This romance was a very confusing idea, and I'm not sure what they were going for. Luna was such a trivial part of the game's story up to this point, and I just don't really miss her. I can maybe comprehend that Noctis is hurting and visiting Tenebrae is more of a labor for him, but the guy doesn't open up about his feelings by design. You might as well have shown me a picture of the place instead of making several coders slave away making an expensive looking skybox. What's funny is that you can break the game and explore the insides of the castle, which makes me think that once upon a time there was a dungeon here. And yeah, that's kind of exciting actually. I don't think it would have been enough to retrospectively heal the apathy I had for Luna, but it might have been cool to see the group fighting without Prompto and 2/3 of Ignis. All we get instead is this ice area. Aw, Noctis, that's not how you give a shit. Arden then turns on a 5G tower that disables Noctis's powers. Now the train has finally arrived at its last stop in Niflheim, the capital of Graulia. We need to race inside to a place called Zegnaudis Keep. And in doing so, we get to crash our beloved car into a wall. Gladio and Ignis get separated from you, and everyone screams because the worst level in the game is upon us. Zegnaudis Keep is a very slow level. Noctis has no weapons, meaning he has to hide from enemies while getting condescended at over the loudspeaker. Many people disliked this level. Okay, everyone disliked this level. Except me, the Final Fantasy god. Okay, wait, is Pro Jared still cancelled? Alright, the second Final Fantasy god. Look, I think, at least on a narrative to gameplay level, this works. It's one of the few times the game says, no, you're not playing however you want, we're setting a mood and you're gonna like it. Without any of his weapons, Noctis finally has to bear the ring. And now, because of episode Ignis, I get why this hurts so much, why it's such a big deal to him. And it becomes a big deal to the player since this is now your only weapon. The ring functions like the game's combat boiled down to its simplest form. Pressing attack turns enemies into primordial soup, draining them until they literally wither away. Blocking will cause the people who attempt to attack you to explode. Then lastly, you can hold the warp button to cast Alterna, draining all of your mana and sucking everyone into a black hole. Add it to the list, I guess. It does sort of break the game because you can just keep warping to replenish MP, then spam the Chernobyl button, but at this point I don't think you need to break the game to beat it. You've got to slink through these halls and pretend you aren't carrying a key to the universe. The hiding mechanics can be a little interesting, if easy, because robots are scary, whether you have the Death Note or just some simple doors. And for all of Arden's blustering, he still has Prompto captured, and that's enough to put things on edge. The writers maimed Ignis and killed Luna, so it's not impossible for us to assume they'll go the extra mile and kill Prompto too at this point. There is a gameplay stint I don't like though. It is very fucking boring. The controls of this game are not meant for the slow digestion of the environment, and Noctis is suited to just jog through corridors. Once you force him into that weird shuffle walk he likes so much, everything feels very wrong. Several times throughout this Niflheim base, you'll be presented with environmental threats. Tin soldiers on the ground that are rigged to explode when you get close, baddies hiding behind doors to ambush you, and corridors full of poison gas that drain your health while inside. The kind of thing that might keep you on your toes if it wasn't for this goddamn HP system. Noctis gains his health back so fast, I think he's got monster energy for blood. It doesn't matter how carelessly you play, Noctis will always shrug it off and be ready for the next booby trap. If the enemies are bearing down on you and your square button committed suicide, Noctis will still be ready. After a while, you do get a watershed moment when Noctis recovers his father's sword, which feels like every other sword in the game, but maybe it's 40 proof. Though in name, this chapter's got something going for it, at least in atmosphere. Except they didn't stick to their guns on this. Final Fantasy XV released 2 very mediocre reviews. Most gave it an 8 out of 10, but for the brutal worlds of AAA, that just isn't enough. Especially when the scoring system of those departments are both arbitrary and usually unreflective of the actual words in the article. The solution, in the minds of Square Enix, was to update the game's actual plot with new cutscenes and scenarios. I have a hunch this was always the idea, and the middling scores just spurred it into action. Hajime Tabata said they would be adding in a new option to Chapter 13, where, after Noctis is separated, the player can opt to play as Gladio and Ignis. They were also very kind in labeling this path as the easy mode, but maybe that's more for Gladio than me. If one of these robots tilts the big guy over, Ignis is gonna have to put his hearing to the test. It ends around the time the gang rejoins Noctis, once he's reclaimed his sword and made peace with destiny and all that jazz. That's why splitting up the level like this isn't something I can get behind. All of that narrative that is core to the game's themes are just skipped. You don't get to see Noctis finally bear the ring, you don't get to see him recover the Sword of the Father, you don't get to slowly find out that the demons you're fighting are actually the people of Niflheim, you just plow through them, with enemies that are 15 levels below you, and you don't even have to do the game's only puzzle. There's an extra scene that shows us how a side character got his, but I don't fucking need that. You wanna know why I don't need that closure? Because that same goon is the final boss of this chapter. I guess I could have found a reason to be sad for him if they didn't cancel his Year 4 DLC. I bet this would have been a very watershed moment had I tied the writers to a chair, but I probably couldn't take them in a fight. I'm gonna rewind just a small bit, as there are two moments in Zegnatus once Gladio and Noctis reunite. The first is the killing of the evil king, who's been transmogrified into a weird demon thing. The other is the rescue of Prompto, who is bound in chains despite us last seeing him in pretty good straits. Here he reveals the truth to the others. And you know what? For all the blustering of episode Prompto, I gotta be honest, I think the scene is pretty nice and speaks for itself.
Still, I can't change where I came from. What I am.
Since when does where you come from matter to you? You never once treated me as a prince.
It's got you there.
Never so much as a highness.
We're done here. Come on, crowned citizen.
You're one of us, right?
Unless you'd rather not be.
Despite the fact that I think the twist is dumb, it's a nice moment, cause we always knew the gang would accept him for what he is. There are some weird continuity errors, like how Prompto speaks as if he's always known he was a clone, but in reality he only found out yesterday. Though when I take 2 steps back, the good shines over the bad in this exchange, even if I have questions as to how he got here. Oh, right, sorry. So now everything in Zegnatus is wrapped up. We just have to kill the reanimated version of Joker 5000,001 and get the rock back. The Ravis boss is one of my favorites in the game. He's a single humanoid target, allowing the poor little camera to get a view of him. Plus, he'll telegraph some of his cooler attacks by surrounding himself with a black aura. The gang doesn't seem to comprehend that, so he'll down them all the time. I tend to spam Prompto's trigger-happy technique on him as much as I can, since it'll track his fast movement. Gladio's impulse works too, but it doesn't deal as much damage, and Ignis is handicapped anyway. Overall, it's in the higher tier of the bosses in the game, and I really like the moment that comes next. After Ravis, the room gets flooded with demons. You and the guys will fight them for what feels like forever, until you get this lovely little countdown. The player has to actively make the choice to leave their friends behind so that Noctis can reach the crystal he's wanted so badly. You can choose to stay here, but it gets more and more desperate. The way it's framed, you sort of feel guilty as Noctis escapes into that elevator. Except that Rock eats Noctis. Okay. The following cutscene throws a lot at us, and some might be happy that things are finally happening, but it's also a bit confusing. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So, remember that guy with the coin and the hat that appears at bad times, and I've been referring to him as the villain this whole game? Well, he just drank the last Mountain Dew. He's also a 10,000-year-old lich that is the living embodiment of darkness, that wields the antithesis to Noctis' powers and has been absorbing a plague that has corrupted his very soul. He's also Nox's great-great-granduncle or something, and can't die. I think that's it. Did I get it all? Inside the rock, we meet Bahamut, the god of exposition. Yes, really. He's gonna tell you the story's big reveal in garbled subtitles. What's that reveal? That Noctis must die in order to erase all of the demons on Eos and remove Arden from power. This would, realistically, be a lot to take in, and we get to see Noctis overcome this ultimatum by watching him get into the fetal position and fading to black for 10 years. You know, you are God. You could have at least given the poor guy a therapist while he sits in there. Or like, I don't know, a PlayStation. This is how the marketing team at Square somehow gained the nerve to call this game a 10-year journey. That is not how a journey works. Me drinking alcohol and waking up blacked out the next morning are 2 separate moments, not my journey into swearing off Everclear. As the game is taking a break, we're gonna start to dive into some other stuff, specifically Final Fantasy 15 Comrades. God, I wish I loved myself more. Comrades is a multiplayer expansion that takes place while Noctis is in the fridge. Here you play as the last guards of Insomnia who go to war against a broken world, forever waiting for their hero to come back. If you're asking if I had my own friends to play this with, fat chance. Not even close. I was alone the entire way. It's fine if no one loves me. They don't understand the fucking mission I'm on right now. Granted, I was alone even if I turned on the multiplayer. This game was a desert long before I dropped in. Hey, Death Stranding, you want to take a look into a broken society? Maybe you should have stopped by here. I really hope this failed. I don't have any numbers because research means hiding from data that scares me. I just hate to think that everything I'm complaining about and all the money that was not given to the actual game ended up profiting Square Enix in the end. Because this fat stack basically created the same world except with a brown filter over it. Well, why bother redoing it if that's where the entire thing is going to be set anyway? Don't you dare bring Yakuza into this. Though it's not as if other games aren't rushing to do the exact same thing. When was the last time you turned on the Ghost of Tsushima multiplayer mode? Yeah, that's what I thought. But frankly, this looks like the game Square Enix would have wanted to make rather than Final Fantasy 15. I could see microtransactions beckoning me at every turn. Expensive clothes as if a drab world of darkness is interested in my fucking fashion sense. Hell, this probably was the correct move for the company. The war against live service has kind of been lost, hasn't it? I mean, there are some good things about it, but I don't know. Because no matter how much I end up playing multiplayer shooters, I don't ever take something away from them. I don't think about the depth of a character or how well an actor did in that one scene. If anything, I'm just considering how unbalanced the game is. I did not play Comrades for long. I didn't want to. It was generally the same combat with a lighter feeling, but even more numbers. The other way to go about playing Final Fantasy 15 forever is to do the endgame content. Ugh, content. I think I hate that word. Every dungeon in the game is technically 2 dungeons. The first is the ones you've done as part of the campaign. Corridors with enemies in them, 2-minute boss fight, royal arm as a reward. The second is a much more difficult dungeon, but the copy-paste rooms have formed a union and seized the means of production. In the kindest words I can, I will humbly recommend that you don't waste your time on these like I did. You'll be grinding out hours and hours of the same enemies, but you will not improve as a person. In fact, I think you will find that society views you as a lesser for it. Obviously, I've sucked this game dry, and there's no harder proof than the fact that I've played it 4 times. First was because I was suckered by the machine. The second to see if I played it wrong. The third because, no, it's bad, let's make a video. Then a fourth because I didn't make the video on the third run and I needed to make sure it was fresh in my mind, but also screw it, the second playthrough is at level 99. I'm gonna see the creme de la creme. Yes, I lack the will to go back and do all of those fucking dungeons again, but I will boot up my old save file to see what was there. Be thankful I told you that. You know how easy it would have been to lie? The only thing stopping me was the fact that I don't want to find out what's underneath the skill floor of society. This did give me a few problems. I already did all of the optional dungeons and the really impressive endgame bosses, until I remembered the secret dungeon. When I said earlier that there isn't a lot to find in EOS, that was true. But there's one place in the game that most people probably have not visited, and no, it's not another crack shack. And if you gave them a description of this place, they'd likely say, fuck that. This is a dungeon that can only be accessed by flying into this absurdly specific spot outside of the Rock of Ravito. A maneuver which sets the tone for this entire dungeon. Holy Christ, this is bullshit. Angling a ship to go down when it doesn't want to go down makes me feel like I'm piloting the goddamn Batmobile. And anything that is not perfect will cause your ship to explode, or not. Sometimes it'll just roll out game over to you as if it was a communion wafer. But I got the airship settled and walked through a stretch of desert with some pretty tough enemies. Fighting higher level mobs is better than your average melee because it slows itself down a bit. Noctis backs up a hair to fight him and you'll rely more on special techniques. I even had this cool moment where I became confused, messing with my controls, so I had to tactically use Gladio's Cyclone move, which Noctis can warp into for a massive combo, overpowering the enemies and giving me enough time to let the effect wear off. That said, it wasn't long before one of the 4 fun police showed up to ruin any tension, or just place the L2 button under probation for a bit. I remember the same thing happening when I did all the extra dungeons a few years ago. I wouldn't say it improves massively, but if you've ever done mid-level combat in an RPG, it feels around that point. Then, I see it. The Piteous Ruins, a dungeon that can only be accessed at nighttime and your friends cannot accompany you inside. Though that is not a problem because there are no foes inside here. This is a platforming challenge, with the emphasis on the word challenge. For someone who is discovering this for the first time like I was, I really found this beginning room to be the hardest, because it really begs the question as to what the fuck you're supposed to do in here. Noctis can climb angles he couldn't before. Falling off warps you right to the top. It's bizarre. And you know what? The Piteous Ruins kind of kick ass. The puzzles and platforming inside are hard, but they're no inhuman feat. The scenery is fucking awesome too, and each room had assets that were specific to this dungeon, like a drop of water in the desert. It was motivating to think about what creepy puzzle room was waiting in the next level. I even kicked up the dungeon 10 times when I remembered that Noctis has an MP3 player, and it let me relive just how good the Final Fantasy 13 soundtrack was. Hell, even Noctis is cheering you on the whole time.
Cake, baby. Cake, baby. Cake, baby.
But you want to know the most shocking thing? This was always in the game. The Piteous Ruins were not snapped into existence with an update, nor did you have to pay for it. And I'm not championing that fact because I want the current Yongye to gas me up. I'm happy with it because it proves these devs maybe always had a plan in mind. The Piteous Ruins exist outside of the sphere of the rest of the game. While each encounter under the sun was built so that every person could complete it, this is telling you, engage with the rules of this dungeon as it is, or go away. And it's creative and fun and satisfying and hilarious how Noctis' friends just sat outside for 5 in-game days without panicking. As glad as I was to walk out of that last dungeon, we need to discuss the real endgame content of 15, because no one boots up a 2-hour analysis to watch the chibi guy go on a fucking rant about BTS Mario Brothers. I was a bit confused bumbling around my old file, but I searched up tough enemies, and I fight this samurai guy. If you can't tell by the footage, I'm very confused and everyone is dying, meaning that this is actually terrible footage, so I tried something a bit more intimidating, a level 140 dreaded behemoth. The highest level you can reach in 15 is 99, so with even all of the best abilities in the game, I'm still outmatched by it stat-wise. Except here is where that dreaded readability problem has finally come back to roost. He tends to spit blizzards all over the map, making it hard to see, but he also has a move that KOs my friends at a single blow, and since I can't fix them not dodging attacks, it's time to really ascend to kinghood and whip out the treasury. Give me 15 taquitos, buddy. Here's what that boss ended up looking like.
Yep. Okay.
Showtime! The Prince of Pain!
Dun, da, 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 dun, da, dum. Dun, 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 dun.
Now, in order to discuss the final area of the game, I need to discuss the part of Final Fantasy XV's story that I perceive as the weakest. The pillar that makes up Noctis' relationship with his father. And if Noctis fumbling the way he expresses himself is a fatal error, this is puppeteering the bad idea and pushing everything else aside so we can fathom the bad idea with our undivided attention. Regis and the Lion of the Lucii are such an integral part of the game's story that you'd really think it'd be the part most people talk about when bringing up Final Fantasy. Him being dead through a majority of the story doesn't have to be a big deal. There's a ton of ways to show that, and no, the card doesn't count. The opening scene in the game is powerful because it's the only one that ever feels like it has another dimension to it. When you start watching it, it's mostly just weird, with Regis giving a bunch of nagging advice that we don't generally need. On a second viewing, you'll realize that it's weird because Regis, knowing that he will never see his son again, is dragging it out and also recognizing that nothing he says will ever be the perfect end to their relationship that he wants it to be. It burns me, because it tries multiple times to get across this relationship between father and son, and you can tell that the actors are giving it their all. It's just that Square Enix decided it would be more important to show you this dumb Michael Bay opening than the scenes the game needed, sadly leaving us to find out what we can about King Regis from other media. For people with working thumbs and a pre-order bonus, you could play A King's Tale. It's a competent side-scroller which stars Regis as the main character, with his own entourage of bums scattered around the 15 universe. There's very little substance or morals or ideas in this, which, you know, is the nature of the beast. Golden Axe was meant to be binged over a Friday night sleepover. I wouldn't expect it to fill a major part of a AAA game's giant flaws. Like, I'm very proud of him for reading his son a bedtime story, but mine did too if you count the label on the back. Plus, they still managed to over-design it with 500 battle mechanics, and yet you can spam the circle button for most of the encounters. However, I don't want to completely dwell in irony, because be it weird or scattered, Regis does have a personality in these stories. Now, I'm not a good film critic. I have ADHD and get distracted and then hate them. Unless, of course, it's a masterpiece like Memento or Drake and Josh's Really Big Shrimp. I watched Kingsglaive before this game came out, and it's the one thing I can't review because nothing will get me like showing a ton of footage from a movie. And usually my ADHD has a point. Unless you want to see this get turned into an episode of The Nostalgia Critic, I say be careful what you wish for. Kingsglaive was a full CG motion picture that was meant to be viewed to prepare fans for the game. Me and a few fellas did watch it when it came out, though it did interrupt our To Catch a Predator marathon. Except there's a problem. Kingsglaive was such a mess of special effects and lore dump that I genuinely can't recall any of it. There was a Starbucks barista on a rampage, a big war, the Lorax was in it, but otherwise Kingsglaive frizzled into this weird spot of my mind where I can recall screenshots but not what happened in it. It features an entirely different cast of characters as well, the protagonist Nix Ulrich only being mentioned in the game through his weapon because he absolutely gets killed for putting on the ring. So I can tell you that it probably wasn't all that important. I can't talk too much about it because I'd have to summon forth the brother of the Joker. If you don't believe I watched watched it, you can quiz me in the comments. I'm not fucking scared. I'd call the writing a step up from the game, but only in the terms that it's allowed to set its own pacing and be 2 hours long. Basically, if the game is Metal Gear Solid 5, then the movie is Metal Gear Solid 4. It also has Luna in it, so minus 10 points from Hufflepuff. The magic also seems like it's on a totally different level. Characters are casting lightning bolts and stuff, similar to the Comrades mode. Before, I thought the crystal's magic was low-key to keep up with the realism, but it seems like that gets thrown out when the Glaives are using it. Or maybe it's just what Aaron Paul was smoking that day. I remember that Noctis suffered that injury, and it weakened him, but it also seems like the identity of the magic is worlds apart because of that. That said, this contains the pivotal moment where King Regis is killed, allowing that thread to finally blossom. Can't show it to you, but he's stabbed in the chest then slowly pushed over. He sacrifices his life so that Luna can escape the city and ferry the magic ring to Noctis, being a callback to how he ran away when her home was taken over. There's a ton of small details that allude to his bizarre parenting style, like how he sent Noctis to a public school and had him live in an apartment rather than the Citadel. Might be some angling at an anime cliche so that our boy could be the coolest, most important dude on Earth and still have quirky high school stuff happen to him. It sort of makes sense when you see that Regis is trying to raise him as his son first and a king second. The truth about Regis is that he knows more than he lets on. From the beginning, he learns that Noctis is fated to die young, dragging him between his two duties, protecting the world and protecting his son. It seems like he begrudgingly settled on the former because he just had no idea what else to do, though it weighs heavily on him at every second. And in one final selfish act, sent Noctis on this road trip so that he can experience as much as he can before his time is up. It's a very sweet connection, but to require a viewer to do this much homework on one of Crazy Steve's bad days? Maybe the value is in the subtlety of this revelation, that you have to dig to find it, and knowing this did endear me to this game by a significant amount. Though it is a little dumb, right? Telling a story in several fractured parts in different mediums inherently means that you're going to lose the people that aren't into certain media formats. If there are 3 pillars of your story, you can't build one out of marble and the other 2 from mystery meat. So now Noctis has woken up from his 10-year hiatus. After sailing back from Cuba, we get to explore an apocalyptic version of Golden Key, now bathed in darkness and crawling with high-level enemies, especially this fucking bean thing. I enjoy Noctis' older look. The hair-beard combo combined with his new permanent scowl gives off a bigger impression than his young design did. I wouldn't say he looks more royal though, but he's gained scars and determination. I also like how if you try to put his king outfit on his younger self, it looks like it doesn't fit right. Suddenly, we are met on the road by Talcott, and he's grown to be a perfectly fine man. Guess Jared was just bringing him down. We're treated to a car ride through the world. The opening third of the map was one of the biggest and most explorable. The contrast between all of our previous road trips is meant to show off all of the destruction that the loss of the light has brought to Eos. The biggest theme of this game, at least to me, is memories, and that's how this feels. We are back at the first gas station, now fortified into a forward operating base. Everyone's back now. They're older, too. Sure, their personalities are intact, but they have moved forward in a subtle way. Gladio is getting married, Ignis has learned to function without his sight, and Prompto is now a trained hunter. You can find out how they've been faring by resting at this trailer multiple times. It feels like one big catching up session for all that's happened. And we get one of those musical swells, followed by the final campfire scene. Ignis cooks the gang one last meal, they get one quiet reprieve. And look, I don't know if you can tell because I just sound like a dick all of the time, but this got me. It's really powerful on your first playthrough. The plot's context is flown out the window. However, in its place, the bonds the crew have between each other almost completely replace it, which is why it's so disappointing that the final area is where a lot of this comes crashing down. The last dungeon of Final Fantasy XV is the destroyed city of Insomnia. We need to carve our way through to the throne room and kill the coin guy, with this awful song called Somnus playing in the background. It's the music from the first trailer they made, however it's very unfitting, being an opera song that drowns out the atmosphere and says, "Appreciate how important this is." The track is composed well, but like ballroom well. Something that you sit and listen to in your nicest suit. Have an Alex McCullough video explain why it works and all that. You know what the first line of that trailer is? It's a Shakespeare quote about how there is no good and evil, just perceptions of good and evil, which was a weird discovery for me, that maybe I'm supposed to ponder the irony here, that I'm doing this because Bahamut said light equals good and dark equals bad. Oh, but we got so upset when making fun of Niflheim got you shadow banned. Maybe there's a metaphor in the fact that they used the music from 10 years ago, as the expectations of people that aren't you and aren't working on your game pressure down on your penultimate moment, then ruin it. Though I think whatever message this song was meant to convey was long changed by the time we are parkour here in Insomnia. You'll push through a straight line, fight some very boring enemies, ending when you reach the throne room. Here, Noctis will ask Prompto to open up his photo album. The player gets to go through all of the pictures they've taken throughout the game and pick the one that means the most to them. Upon which the gang runs into the throne room to find Arden, who has enjoyed his 10 years by stringing up the corpses of almost every character I didn't like. He knocks everyone out, then flees to the streets of Insomnia. Arden is not the best villain. He suffers in the same way that a lot of the supporting cast does, in that he just doesn't have enough screen time to establish his motive or personality. Games have managed to set up a villain at the end. It's rare, but it's happened. Sadly, outside of some cool thematic elements, Arden is not an interesting character. He's a clever trickster type, but in a very 14-year-old just watched Death Note kind of way. You walk down a hall and he goes, "I knew you'd go that way." Makes puns about the weather and slaps women. I'm never under the impression that he's smarter than me or that he's thinking 2 steps ahead. There is but one solution. And, no, I can't do it this time. Fuck your Season 3. I'm not doing it anymore. I've played the DLCs, watched your bad movie, and your anime. How much money can you demand of me? I'm sure it's even good like the other DLCs, but I'm just so indisposed of your money fiefdom that, no, you're right, I don't have time, shut up. I'm gonna move on with my... What's in your mouth? Open your mouth. What are you chewing on? Open your mouth! Come here! An anime? Why? You finished your anime when the game came out. Why did you need to make another? For the sake of brevity and getting us to the final boss fight, I'll tell you that this anime is not good. And not in an oh-ho-ho smug YouTuber dismissing thing way. Each shot seems to fail to represent what it actually needs to. Sometimes it's not even clear what's happening without rewinding a few seconds. The Spark Notes was that Arden was one of the first kings of Lucis around the start of a plague called the Star Scourge, which he can heal by siphoning it from the people in his kingdom. He also dated a blonde woman who could speak to the gods but somehow had even less personality than Luna. Eventually, he absorbed too much darkness and became corrupted, causing the gods to deny him his throne to his arrogant younger brother. However, the plague he absorbed made him incapable of death, so he spent centuries mauling about it, finally coming out when his resting place got in the way of Niflheim's new Hyperloop, allowing him to attempt vengeance against the gods that abandoned him and the family that took what was his. Even though he knows that his death will solve all the problems in this world because Bahamut left a note on his Series X, he persisted anyway out of pure hatred, hence why Arden has been waiting in Insomnia, to fight Noctis for shits and giggles while helping it at sometimes and killing the people he loves at others. Now he'll knock our friends out and run to the city, where Noctis has to go after him alone. This is the final boss fight of Final Fantasy XV. Just Noctis and Arden on the streets of Insomnia. He uses all of Noct's royal arms, excluding a few. The Sword of the Father, Luna's Trident, and the Ring of the Lucii. Same deal as Noctis though. The weapons have nearly identical patterns that aren't easy to break down by looking at them. So you might as well categorize them into long-range and close-range attacks, with some that tease the block command. The only notable attack is one where he'll fire a wave blast in a sweeping motion that needs to be warped through. The map is also pretty large, giving you a long range to warp to safety, allowing you to have a near infinite supply of MP for the battle. The track for this fight is also one of my least favorite. It's called Magna Insomnia. It's got a lot of orchestral instruments and adds an overall dark, brooding atmosphere. I'd even call it creepy. I don't know, I'm not a music theorist, but this is not the time to pull out the tricky little piano and the violin. Look at the situation here. Noctis, now confident in his fate, and Arden, still clinging to the hope that he can somehow spite it, both fight using the powers they've come to wield this entire game. You're fighting over who gets to rule, light versus dark, and there might even be some layers as to how these characters only got their sight by happenstance. Except the track is so spooky. Ooh, where does he get all those coins? It's a compelling situation to be in, but Magna Insomnia lays a mat over your head and pushes you into this kind of lull where there really should have been a track with some energy to it. Doesn't need to be like The True Mirror or anything, but something similar to the previous Final Fantasy boss themes, where a choir screams Latin at you. The other phase of this fight involves the two of you going Super Saiyan, and it's similar to the Leviathan fight in that you blast stuff at him, and to be completely honest with you, I have no fucking clue what this game wants from me. I thought I'd be cute and spam all of my healing items before this fight so that it'd have some tension, but I don't get it. Noctis freaks out and jumps all over the place, and I died. I died a few times, though at some point something clicked and I mashed circle harder than any god ever could, killing Arden for a temporary amount of time. After beating him, you get to laugh as all your friends walk down the fucking stairs to meet you again. Noctis wishes everyone a farewell in the same way that Regis sent him away at the start of the game. So Noctis sits on the throne and you wonder for a second, will this game actually kill him? To summarize some things that I don't find all that interesting, Noctis meets Arden in the spirit world and the two fight in a QTE battle, for Noctis to completely erase him for good. Then Noctis disappears too. Credits roll, and we see that he found happiness in the afterlife with the most boring human being on the planet. Tragic and happy at the same time, but I will definitely say he looks better with a beard. There's a few grudges I have with this ending, and it's not that Noctis dies. I won't miss him. I think it's just that all the context this game failed to provide us with makes it hard to grasp the gravity of his death. Look, goofy memes aside, I think there is value in this ending. It's a story half about fate and half about love. Though, a lot of people just walked away with nothing. Except, this probably isn't the only ending you've seen. Yep, I was saving this one. Rewind to DLC number 3. If Ignis opts to let himself be captured, he'll instead be taken to Zeknatis Keep with Arden. Things go pretty bad pretty quickly, but he dons the ring again. Except this time, he can actually beat Arden in a fight. Taken a step further, Noctis will show up after Arden vanishes. In this version, instead of being dragged into the crystal, Noctis goes into it willingly. He's also able to harness the power of the crystal to restore Ignis' sight, leading us to a scene where Ignis is able to find a way for Noctis to circumvent fate and is finally able to rule his kingdom. Don't get too comfy, Ignis. In another realm, he evaporated you because he didn't want to eat his vegetables. If the ending was a bitter pill to swallow, then this would be baby food. The ending is that Noctis accepted his duty before it was too late. No one dies, not even Ravis. Well, okay, Luna is still dead, but her and Jared are the cutest pen pals. There was also a book that ends with Luna being revived, the exposition god turning on everyone, and Arden becoming the good guy. Then everyone lives. Did that sound like I read it off a Wikipedia page? Well, I fucking did. I'm cashing in my token. This ending was meant to supplement episode Noctis and Luna, DLC in Year 2 that never saw the light of day. And I'm going to break down more complicated feelings on the ending, but I want to stick to talking about the development for just a bit more. Because how much faith you put in a particular story can affect what you're going to take away from it. The Last of Us 2 has a really deep story, but I think people are very uncharitable to it because they hate small boobs. Final Fantasy episode Dusky was a playable demo that came out with Final Fantasy Type 0, and I'm very embarrassed to admit that I own both of these because Type 0 was incredibly boring. This demo is contained to an earlier version of a middling side quest where the party hunts down a behemoth. The only noticeable visual difference is that the demo runs at a terrible frame rate, like someone tried to plug Kojima's brain into a Super Nintendo. But this version of the game was from a build 2 years before the true and honest game code would be finalized. The camera would focus at sights like normal human eyes would, the HUD felt more readable, and the combat was, a lot better, which is to say that this is like a great first date. It's the same deal as the regular game. You have a single button to attack and a single button to block, but Noctis is balanced in a way that makes things so much more engaging. Mana drains faster, forcing you to take cover at rocks. Taking your friends out of danger requires the both of you to be vulnerable for a second, and instead of having 4 weapons to swap from on the fly, Noctis can personalize a basic set of combos, with each weapon carrying a special power which also takes from his mana pool. The technique system is gone, but in return the passive powers the gang has are much more potent. Prompto has this ability in the base game called Scintilla, but I'd tell you that I never actually saw it in action. It allows him to dodge an attack then briefly stun the enemy, but the stun is less than a second and no one could take advantage of it. But in Dusky, look at it. It's stunning a giant boss. It feels as though he's on the field making a difference. And holy shit, Ignis has a basic healing spell, and items aren't everywhere. I don't want to put this on a pedestal because it's possible that it had some major flaws that would become apparent in a 60-hour game. But as it stands, I wish they sorta kept most of this, especially the health and MP system. Warping to a safe spot no longer instantly fills the meter, and health functions like an actual health bar. Though I guess I'm being a bit of a weirdo. The fact of the matter is what we have is a completely different game, and replaying Dusky made me realize just how much was changed, from the combat to the control scheme to even the way that the characters grunt when swinging swords. I guess all they had to do was to motivate the main actor by threatening to fire him. This pumped the shit out of me when it came out. It felt like nothing I had ever played before. An action game with the thematic elements of a JRPG. Then Platinum Demo came, and then the game did. Whatever happened in these 2 years, I blame Square Enix, goddammit. They were probably the ones pushing for most of the nonsense. 3 separate crafting systems, and you know they failed because after building hundreds of food items, they never got a single episode of Binging with Babish. And if you like the base game but also just really enjoy watching someone condescend your taste, that's fine. I wrote almost 70 pages. You have to disagree with something I said. But I think you probably need some therapy, or at least a very good boxing match in the comments. Hell, part of me is jealous that you were able to find in one playthrough what took me 4. I have one last moment about Final Fantasy 15 story I want to talk about, but first, let's go over everything one last time. There's Final Fantasy 15 the game, Then there's Final Fantasy XV Kingsglaive, a CGI movie that is critical to understanding the catalyst of the story. Final Fantasy XV Brotherhood, an anime series that sets up the primary cast. Final Fantasy episodes Gladio, Ignis, Prompto, 3 DLCs that take place during moments that were cut from the OG game, because why not make people pay for that? Final Fantasy XV Pocket Edition, the game converted to mobile. Final Fantasy XV Comrades, an MMO that no one fucking wanted. Final Fantasy XV, A King's Tale, a side-scrolling beat-em-up for understanding a side character. Final Fantasy XV X Assassin's Creed, the circus forgot to pick up its clowns. Final Fantasy XV X Terra Wars, I don't know either. Final Fantasy XV X Final Fantasy XIV, you get a new summon to ruin the game. Final Fantasy XV Episode Duskai, you were too young, too beautiful. Final Fantasy XV Platinum Demo, a promotional demo that takes place in the protagonist's dreams and nightmares. Final Fantasy XV Dawn of the Future, a book that recounts the events of the game except the ending they wrote was 10 times happier. Final Fantasy XV X Final Fantasy Dissidia. Oh, I'm breaking my throat. Final Fantasy XV Episode Arden. Nope, I still don't want to do it. Final Fantasy XV Pocket Edition, Deluxe Edition, the mobile game converted back to be played on console. Final Fantasy XV Prologue Parting Ways, a Japanese audiobook that gives us the context of what the protagonist's lives were like before their home was destroyed. Final Fantasy XV X Tekken, still got better things to do. Final Fantasy XV A New Empire. All of that, over 10 years, and no one remembers any of it. There's so many stories in Final Fantasy XV. Hundreds. Okay, I can't fit hundreds on screen, but you get the idea. Well, there's one last story. Something I made just for you. Because, believe it or not, I'm not actually all that happy that these things are getting forgotten. Because being the brother of the Joker can't be that bad. An adaptation and fan fiction of Final Fantasy XV Parting Ways.
Well, I entrust this matter to you. Yes, sir.
Pardon me. Wait, Gladio?
What are you doing here, Prompto? He's here for his Crown's Guard uniform. Prompto Argentum. Am I right?
Yes, sir.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I understand you decided to take this journey as his friend. Take pride in your position at his side.
Right. And, thank you.
You gonna wait for Noct here?
Nah, I think I'll head home for a bit.
Why? Forget something?
No, nothing like that. Just thought I'd show my parents my new digs.
Sounds good.
It's kind of proof that I'm worthy of going on this trip, you know? Just hope they're home.
Not much you can do if they aren't.
If they're not, I'll come right on back.
You've got time. My family and I are going out to eat.
Ma, Dad, I'm home. Yeah, well, I'll hang out a bit. Cheese! I guess I'll just show you guys when I get home. Get pumped. You're gonna love it. Evening, guys.
Evening. You see your parents?
Nah, they weren't home.
That's rough.
Nah, it's no biggie.
We're gonna make him proud. For real this time.
Damn right we are.
Okay, in early 2018, a new version of the game was put into stores, the Royal Edition, the final version of the game with all of the DLCs except not really. With only 3 months between its announcement and its release, very few people knew what was inside it, but one line grabbed some attention, a rehaul of the final dungeon. At the time, I was guessing this was a cheap cash-in to resell a game that hadn't even been out for 2 years, cause you know, I was right. Though whatever cursed greed spawned this version, I can't help but see it as a big upgrade. There's now an underground resistance where all of your friends are. That miserable straight shot through from before has been expanded into a full breathing cityscape, and I think I fucking love it.
Brothers and sisters, I ask you to stand by me and fight at my side for the light and for the future of our world.
It's got all of the things that make Final Fantasy XV good. The cast of characters are on display. The enemies are much more unique and fighting them can actually be difficult. And Somnus is gone, with a new musical track being introduced to go throughout the level. Don't get me wrong, I actually listen to Somnus in my off time, alongside all of these other songs because I am starting to believe that I have Stockholm Syndrome. Screw it, everyone's here. Here's a side quest where I play with my comrade's character, who does not look like Vela Wild. Although, maybe the creepier thing is watching the gang, having gone through so much to get decent character development, joyously bob back and forth while faced with a soulless and thoughtless avatar that represents the new wave of live service media meant to replace them. Hear that determination in Noctis's voice as he works in tandem with his team?
Gladio. Once this is all over, one thing at a time. Fair enough. Ignis. Pronto.
There's a flaming bad dog at the gates, and that guy Core that you did those first missions with, he fights with you again, and you're the same power level as him now. After you beat Cerberus, you get to climb this tower and fight the Old Kings. 3 to be exact. The Fierce, the Rogue, and the Mystic. However, instead of being some lame boss that you just dodge until it falls over, the game asks you to swap your character as each of these bosses serve as a mini ending to each cast member. The Fierce requires you to play as Gladio and use his high damage capacity to burst through its defense. The Rogue moves too fast to be hit with a sword and you'll need to pull out Prompto, using his star shell to reveal her, and his guns deal more damage. And the Mystic is vulnerable to fire, so you need Ignis to charge up his full clarity and use a flurry of flaming daggers to put him down. Each fight gives you a moment where the characters get to state what they stand for, and they get to show that they mattered in this story just as much as Noctis did. It's so damn good. All of this Royal Edition dungeon feels like the quality of the DLCs finally brought to the main game. The Ardent fight still ends things on a sour note though, right? You still climb up there, his music is still bad, takes place in a boring open street, and plays like the stalest bits of the combat system. Well, yes, and there's no fixing that, but did I ever tell you that the fight before the Old Kings is the best moment in the whole game? Right before you ascend the stairs, the last of the 6 is waiting for us, Ifrit, the god of fire. It takes place in the Citadel, the last place Noctis saw his father and where the gang got ready for their adventure. A massive arena with plenty of different places to warp to. You'll fight him everywhere, in the center, on the lower decks, in the air, stretching through several different phases, and this fight is largely untouched from the main game. It kicks ass from patch 1.0 and still kicks ass now. There's also an actual tactic for fighting him. Ifrit will imbue himself in flames, making him invincible, requiring you to cast an ice spell either through Ignis or your own inventory. Even its track Hellfire is a perfect mix. It's got this confident beat to it that shows that Noctis and his friends are up against something bigger than themselves, but they're also ready to meet that. They rely on each other as if it's second nature, and it just feels like Final Fantasy. So much so that I'm going to embarrass myself by playing a line that makes me genuinely emotional. This feels like all of Final Fantasy XV's best moments, and it gets forgotten because Ifrit is a no-name character that just gets plopped in for this moment. Especially cause, you know, does this sound familiar? Once you hit a certain point, a god comes down and kills him? This scenario should have been the final boss. Remove Ifrit and his useless addition to the story, have Noctis face Arden on the streets, then have him transform into a massive blight demon that is essentially the Ifrit fight. Then you'd have a real memorable finale. There is some value in things coming down to a man versus man scenario, but I'd rather you take what makes this game good and just hammer on that. For what it is though, Ifrit is worth it. There are even commendable bits of this game's ending. I'm glad that this final dungeon is a significant wrap-up to all of the game's smaller threads. I'm glad that it gave us a real level to explore. I'm glad that it doesn't hold that last punch. Look, all I'm trying to say is, I think when people watch videos like this one, they need it to be black and white. To this game, I am both the victim and the victor, and that's not true. It's not the best it can be, but I have a feeling for most people, stepping into that throne room and going through all the photos they took throughout the game, seeing the places that this group went to, seeing their road trip condensed into this string of pictures, that's a hard feeling to create. Most of this game blurs past you. Then you open this album and go, maybe there was more behind the scenes. The ending of the game is still the same, but it hits differently this time. Look, I'm gonna be open with you. I have heavily changed this script from when it started. I needed some footage from the last playthrough, and I'm not going to kid you, I somehow cried after seeing this game end for the 4th time. I'm not going to force you to sit here and watch the scene with me, because god if I lost it in front of an audience. The way the track Somnus builds up, and you expect the same notes, only for it to explode into the track Somnus Ultima, as Noctis rips himself apart and uses the Knights of the Round Table summon to close things out, Damn. I don't think anyone's ever accused the ending of this game to be misery bait, but I don't think anyone's ever accused it of being anything else. It's a story about this guy who is caught in the weight of these systems, all of them just looking to use him. Politics don't care about his part in this, the gods don't care about his part in this, the only thing he ever got was the love of his father and some stupid friends. Maybe now that I know that, maybe now that I've given it a chance, Noctis sitting on that throne finally has weight. Just those memories coalescing into what was probably the world's best Make-A-Wish. The ending plays out in 3 scenes. The one we just saw where Noctis sacrifices himself for the world, the one where he finally gets Luna, and the true ending scene, showing Noctis finally thanking his friends at the campfire. And, yeah.
You guys are the best.
The one thing I will always champion in this game is the sheer effort in it. The way everyone's body language is given the tiniest details. I can pick out several moments where the subtle action of a character conveys an insane amount of emotion. Their voices crack and it's so distinctly human that I can't just write it off like every other high-budget game that wasn't what it was hyped up to be. It's still not a great product. Its combat is a mess, the open world is boring, and half the game is just nonsense. Though I think that if you are willing to try and pull what you can from these scenes, there is a story that desperately wants to be felt. And I don't know if I have a lesson to all this. Maybe there shouldn't be one. Maybe that's the point, that we shouldn't attach these exonerating reflections to stuff that just is, at the end of the day, a video game by some dudes in a money castle. But the fact that anything got made is commendable in its own right, especially when I can tell, if given the chance, they could have hammered in on what made it great. Final Fantasy 15 is kinda dumb, but I also think that I like it too. I like this dumb fucking game. Yep, that's all there was in this one.